You wake up in late November, 1347. The straw beneath your body crackles like old parchment, and the air inside your cottage tastes metallic, sharp with the promise of frost. Outside, the wind carries a sound you haven't heard yet this year. That hollow whistle that means winter isn't just coming anymore. It's here, breathing down your neck like a debt collector who knows exactly what you owe. Your blanket is rough wool, the kind that itches against your skin but holds warmth like a miser holds coins. You pull it tighter and feel the familiar weight of dread settling in your stomach. Not the dramatic movie trailer kind of dread. Just the quiet certainty that the next few months will test every survival skill you've ever learned, and probably a few you haven't. The first thing you notice is the silence. Yesterday, birds still chattered in the bare branches. Today, nothing. Even the mice in your walls have gone quiet, as if they know something you don't. Or maybe they know exactly what you know, and they're just better at preparing for it. You step outside and the cold hits your face like a slap from someone who really means it. The sky is the colour of old pewter, heavy and low, pressing down on the village like a lid on a pot. In the distance you can see smoke rising from maybe 3 or 4 chimneys. Not the dozens there should be. Winter has a way of showing you exactly how many of your neighbours didn't make it through the plague, the harvest failures, or simply the grinding mathematics of medieval life. But here's what you don't realise yet. This winter will be different. Not just cold, but the kind of cold that medieval chroniclers will later describe as the fury of God's own breath. The kind that freezes wine solid in the chalice and makes grown men weep actual tears that turn to ice on their cheeks. Modern meteorologists centuries later will call it the beginning of the Little Ice Age. You just call it Tuesday because you don't know any better. Your stomach growls, a sound that reminds you of the wolf pack that was spotted near the old mill last week. Hunger and cold make everything sound like a threat. You inventory your winter stores with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done this calculation too many times before. A small barrel of salted pork, some dried beans that rattle like teeth in a skull, a few precious loaves of hard bread that could probably be used as weapons if necessary. The arithmetic is simple and terrifying. You have food for maybe 6 weeks if you eat carefully, maybe 8 if you eat like a bird with an eating disorder. Winter typically lasts 12 to 16 weeks. Congratulations, you've just discovered that survival is basically a word problem where the answer is always not enough. You check your firewood pile and your heart sinks faster than a stone in a well. Maybe 2 weeks of warmth if you're generous with the logs. Maybe 4 if you burn them like you're rationing the last candles in. A cathedral. The forest is picked clean by now. Every fallen branch, every dead tree, claimed by someone faster or more desperate than you. Wood has become currency, and you're about to be very, very poor. Listen to the wind picking up, how it rattles the shutters like someone testing the locks on your door. Your cottage was built by people who understood winter, but it wasn't built for this. The chinking between the logs has cracked over the summer. The roof has a leak that seemed charming in autumn rain, but will become a death sentence when that rain turns to snow. Your neighbour, Aldrich, stumbles out of his cottage, looking like he aged 5 years overnight. His face has that hollow look people get when they're doing the same calculations you just finished. He nods at you, not friendly, just acknowledgement. You're both members of the same club now, people who might not seize spring. The membership fee is everything you've got. Storm coming, he says, and his breath makes white clouds that disappear almost instantly. Even his words are being swallowed by the cold. You nod back because what else is there to say? Of course there's a storm coming. You can feel it in your bones, in the way your joints ache, in the way the air itself seems to be holding its breath. But saying it out loud makes it real in a way that hurts. The children have already disappeared inside. No more playing in the lanes, no more games of hide and seek among the haystacks. They sense danger the way animals do, instinctively, completely. Smart kids. They understand that winter isn't a season in medieval times, it's a siege, and your body is the castle under attack. You spend the day doing what everyone does before a storm, everything you can think of, and nothing that feels like enough. You move your precious supplies closer to the fire, you stuff rags into the gaps in your walls, you check and double-check the latch on your door, because when the wind really starts howling, even the strongest locks can fail. As evening approaches, the temperature drops like a stone. You can actually feel it happening, degree by degree, like someone slowly turning down the flame under a pot. The last light fades from the pewter sky, and darkness falls with the weight of a heavy blanket. Your cottage becomes an island of dim warmth in a sea of black cold. You light your single candle, precious tallow that cost more than you wanted to spend, and sit by the fire with a bowl of thin soup, turnips, a bit of salt, water. It tastes like survival, bland, necessary, and somehow comforting in its very plainness. This might be the last warm meal you have for days if the storm is as bad as the air promises it will be. Through your small window you can see snowflakes beginning to fall. Not the pretty, gentle snow of children's stories. These are small, hard flakes that hit the glass like tiny hammers. They're falling fast now, and you know from experience that this kind of snow doesn't stop, politely after an hour or two. This kind of snow falls until the world disappears. The snow doesn't start gently. Medieval weather doesn't believe in easing you into anything. You wake up to a sound like thousands of tiny demons tap dancing on your roof, and when you peer through the ice-crusted window you realise the world has been erased overnight. Everything you knew yesterday, the path to the well, the fence posts, even the neighbour's cottage 30 feet away, has vanished under a blanket of white that seems to be growing deeper even as you watch. This isn't This is nature having a complete meltdown, medieval style. You push against your door and it barely budges. Snow has drifted against it like a solid wall, packed tight by wind that sounds like it's trying to tear your cottage apart board by board. When you finally force it open, the cold rushes in like an invasion army, stealing your breath and making your eyes water instantly. The tears freeze on your cheeks before you can wipe them away. Outside, the wind isn't just blowing, it's screaming. Actually screaming like a living thing in pain. The sound goes straight through your bones and settles in your teeth. This is what medieval people called a wolf wind, and standing in it for more than a few minutes can literally freeze you to death. Your exposed skin starts to sting within seconds, then goes numb, which is your body's polite way of saying you're about to lose some fingers if you don't get inside right now. You manage to gather an armload of your precious firewood before retreating back into your cottage. But even that small task leaves you shaking. Not from cold, from the realization that you're completely, utterly trapped. The storm has turned your home from a shelter into a prison, and you're serving a sentence that could last for days. Here's your medieval survival fact. Storms like this killed more people than wars, plagues, and famines combined in Northern Europe. Not because people were stupid, but because medieval houses were basically elaborate tents with delusions of grandeur. When the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there for weeks, even the best-built cottage became a race between your fuel supply and hypothermia. Guess which one usually won? You feed your fire carefully, like you're performing surgery. Each log is precious now, irreplaceable. The flames lick hungrily at the wood, and for a moment your cottage fills with blessed warmth. But you can already feel the cold seeping in through every crack, every gap, every imperfection in your walls. Your house is fighting a losing battle against physics, and physics doesn't care about your feelings. The wind shifts direction, and suddenly your fire starts smoking backward down the chimney. Thick, acrid smoke fills the room, making you cough, and your eyes burn. This is a medieval winter classic. The wind outside creates pressure that pushes smoke back into your living space. Your choice now is simple. Freeze without a fire, or slowly suffocate with one. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where even staying warm is trying to kill you. You open a shutter, just a crack to let the smoke escape, and snow immediately starts blowing in like confetti at the world's worst party. The flakes don't melt when they hit your floor, they just pile up, because your cottage is barely warmer than the outside air. You're not heating your home anymore, you're just making it slightly less lethal than the alternative. Listen to how the storm sounds different now. The wind has found the weak spots in your roof and you can hear it probing, testing, looking for ways in. There's a rhythmic banging as a loose shutter somewhere pounds against the wall. Somewhere else, wood is creaking ominously, like your cottage is sighing under the weight of all that snow. Medieval buildings weren't designed for this kind of stress. They were designed by people who hoped winters would be reasonable and polite. Your water bucket has a skin of ice on top, even though it's sitting right next to the fire. You break through it with your knife handle, and the ice is thick enough to hear it crack like broken glass. If the water inside your heated cottage is freezing, you don't want to think about what's happening to the well outside. Spoiler alert, it's probably solid ice all the way down. Food becomes a strategic decision now. You're burning calories just to stay alive, shivering is hard work, and your body is basically doing involuntary exercises all day long to keep your core temperature from dropping. But you can't eat too much because you don't know how long this storm will last. Medieval storms didn't come with weather forecasts and convenient end times. They lasted until they felt like stopping. You ration yourself to a small bowl of porridge made with the last of your oats and some water you melted from snow. It tastes like disappointment mixed with a faint hint of hope. The warm liquid in your stomach feels like a small miracle, but it's gone too quickly, leaving you hungrier than before. The real enemy isn't the cold though, it's the isolation. You can't see your neighbours, you can't check if they're alive, you can't share resources or work together. The storm has turned your village into a collection of individual survival experiments, and you won't know the results until it's over. Some cottages will have smoke still rising from their chimneys when the snow clears, others won't. Through the longest night you've ever experienced, you feed your fire one precious log at a time and listen to the storm rage outside like an angry god. You doze fitfully in your chair, wrapped in every piece of cloth you own, waking up every hour or so to stir the coals back to life. Sleep deeply, and you might not wake up at all. By morning, if you can call it morning when the sun is hidden behind clouds thick enough to walk on, you realise this isn't a storm anymore. It's a siege, and winter is winning. Day 3 of the storm, and you're starting to understand medieval math. Not the kind they teach in monastery schools, but the brutal arithmetic of survival where every calculation ends in fractions of a life. Your firewood pile, which seemed adequate 2 days ago, now looks like a small, pathetic monument to optimism. At your current rate of burning, which is the minimum needed to prevent your water from turning solid, you have maybe 6 days of fuel left. The storm shows no signs of stopping. You've developed a new relationship with cold. It's no longer just uncomfortable. It's become a living thing that follows you around your cottage, waiting for you to make a mistake. When you move away from the fire to check your food stores, cold wraps around your shoulders like a heavy cloak. When you reach for something on a high shelf, it crawls up your sleeves and makes your fingers clumsy and slow. It's patient, persistent, and absolutely certain it will win. Your breathing has become visible inside your own home. Every exhale creates a small cloud that dissipates slowly in the dim light. You watch these little ghosts of your breath and realize they're like tiny messages from your body. Still alive, still trying, still here. For now, the hunger is getting creative. It's no longer just an empty feeling in your stomach, it's started affecting your thinking. You find yourself staring at things that aren't food and wondering if they could become food. The leather hinges on your door, the tallow candles that provide your only light, your own boots, which are made of actual cowhide and therefore technically edible, though the thought makes your remaining rational mind recoil in horror. Here's your medieval survival fact that nobody talks about. Cannibalism wasn't unthinkable during the worst winter famines, not because people were monsters, but because the alternative was watching your children die of starvation. Medieval chroniclers recorded instances during severe winters where people made choices that would haunt them forever, if they lived long enough to be haunted. Your ancestors weren't more moral than you, they were just more desperate. You've started talking to yourself, which feels crazy until you realize that the sound of a human voice, even your own, is keeping you sane. You narrate your actions like you're telling a story to an invisible audience. Now I'm adding another stick to the fire. Not a big one, just enough to keep the flames alive. There, that's better. Still have some warmth. The snow outside has reached your windowsill. You can no longer see out, which means you're effectively buried alive in your own home. Your cottage has become a tomb that you happen to still be breathing in. The weight of all that snow is making new sounds. Creaking, settling, the occasional crack that makes you freeze and listen intently. Is that just the house adjusting, or is it the sound of your roof getting ready to collapse? You've developed a routine that would seem insane to your summer self, but makes perfect sense now. Every few hours you check the fire, then you check your water, breaking the new ice that forms constantly. Then you check your food stores, though the numbers never change and they're depressing every time. Then you check the integrity of your walls, looking for new cracks, new places where the cold might be creeping in. It's like being the lighthouse keeper of your own survival. Water has become your most immediate problem. Melting snow takes firewood, and firewood is life. But without water, you'll die faster than you'll die from cold or hunger. You've started collecting snow in every container you own, letting it melt slowly near the fire, trying to conserve fuel. The resulting water tastes flat and somehow empty, like it's missing something essential. Which it is. It's missing the minerals and life that make regular water actually nourishing. Your clothes have become your armour. You haven't taken them off since the storm started, because undressing, even for a moment, would mean exposing skin to air so cold it feels like being stabbed with icicles. You sleep in everything you own, wrapped in every blanket and cloth, looking like a human burrito that's given up all hope of being attractive. Medieval people understood that vanity was a luxury for people who weren't actively dying. The silence between wind gusts is almost worse than the howling. In those moments, you can hear your heart beating, your breathing, the small sounds your stomach makes when it's eating itself. And underneath all of that, you can hear something else. Nothing. No neighbours, no animals, no life at all except yours, hanging on by the thinnest possible thread. You've started to dream about warmth the way a starving person dreams about food. Not just being warm, but being gloriously, excessively warm. Lying in summer sunshine until your bones heat through. Sitting by a roaring fire big enough to warm an entire hall. These dreams are so vivid that waking up is like being slapped back into a nightmare. Food has become theatre. You chew each spoonful of thin gruel slowly, trying to convince your stomach that it's getting more than it actually is. You hold warm liquid in your mouth longer than necessary, savouring not the taste, there isn't much, but the brief sensation of internal warmth. Every meal is a performance for an audience of one, and the reviews are always the same, not enough. Day 4 arrives without fanfare, marked only by the gradual transition from black darkness to grey darkness, visible through the snow piled against your window. You realise you haven't seen actual sunlight since this began. You're starting to forget what it looks like, feels like. Your world has shrunk to the dim orange glow of your fire and the endless patient presence of cold waiting just beyond the light. You do the math again, because math doesn't lie even when you desperately want it to. Food for 3 more days if you eat almost nothing. Fuel for maybe 5 days if you let the fire burn lower than safety would normally allow. And the storm will end when it ends, which could be tomorrow or next week or never. This is how the people died in medieval winters. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, quietly, 1 degree and 1 calorie at a time. Week 2 of the storm, and your body has started making executive decisions without consulting you first. It's begun eating itself from the inside out, starting with the parts it deems least essential for survival. Your muscles are getting smaller, your face more angular. You catch a glimpse of yourself in the small piece of polished metal you use as a mirror, and you look like someone else wearing your clothes, someone considerably less substantial. Your hands shake constantly now, not just from cold but from hunger. Fine motor controllers has become a luxury your body can't afford. You drop things regularly, spoons, sticks for the fire, your precious water cup. Each fumbled object feels like a small betrayal from fingers that used to be reliable. Medieval people called this the hunger shakes, and they knew it meant you were running out of time in a very literal sense. The headaches started 3 days ago and haven't stopped. Not sharp pain, but a constant dull pressure behind your eyes, like someone is very gently but persistently trying to crack your skull open. This is your brain responding to the slow starvation by conserving energy, shutting down non-essential functions like clear thinking and optimism. Your mind feels foggy, thoughts moving like they're swimming through thick porridge. You've started seeing things that aren't there. Not hallucinations exactly, but your peripheral vision keeps catching movement that doesn't exist. Your brain, deprived of adequate fuel, is starting to fill in gaps with its own creative content. A shadow becomes a person. A creak becomes footsteps. The wind becomes voices calling your name. Your medieval ancestors called this hunger madness, and they knew it was a sign that your body was beginning to shut down its most complex systems. Here's your uncomfortable medieval fact. Prolonged starvation doesn't just make you thin, it makes you stupid. Your brain, which normally consumes about 20% of your daily calories, starts to slow down when those calories disappear. Memory becomes unreliable, decision-making becomes impaired. People in the final stages of starvation often made choices that seemed irrational, but were actually their starving brains trying to problem-solve with insufficient resources. Your sleep has become strange and fractured. You doze off without meaning to, sometimes while sitting up, sometimes mid-task. Then you snap awake with that horrible moment of confusion where you can't remember where you are or what you are doing. Sleep and waking have blended into a continuous state of exhausted, semi-consciousness. Your body is trying to conserve energy by shutting down whenever possible, but it's doing so without your permission. Food thoughts have become intrusive and constant. You find yourself remembering meals from years ago with photographic clarity. The taste of fresh bread with butter, the satisfaction of a thick stew with actual meat, the sweet burst of an apple picked right from the tree. These memories are so vivid they make your mouth water, which would be embarrassing if there was anyone left to be embarrassed in front of. Your brain is desperately searching its files for any memory of satisfaction it can use to distract from current reality. You've started chewing things that aren't food: leather straps, wooden spoon handles, even the rough wool of your blanket. Your jaw needs something to do, and your stomach acid has nothing to work on, so your body has convinced itself that the act of chewing might somehow create sustenance. It doesn't, but the mechanical action provides a tiny psychological comfort, like your body is pretending to be nourished. The cold feels different now. Instead of fighting it, you've started to feel oddly warm at times, which is actually terrifying because you know what that means. Paradoxical undressing, medieval people called it, the final stage before freezing to death, when your confused hypothermic brain starts to feel hot and people remove their clothes in the snow. You haven't reached that point yet, but the fact that you're occasionally feeling warm in a freezing cottage is not a good sign. Your urine has become dark and scanty, appearing only once a day and looking like tea that's been steeping for hours. Your body is hoarding every drop of water it can, shutting down non-essential functions to keep your vital organs barely functional. Medieval physicians would have recognized this as a sign that death was perhaps days away, though they wouldn't have known the scientific reasons behind it. You've stopped being able to smell your own body odour, which is probably for the best since you haven't washed in weeks and your clothes have become part of your skin. But you've developed an incredibly sensitive sense of smell for food. You can detect the faintest traces of anything edible from impossible distances. Your body has repurposed your sensory equipment for survival, making you into a human bloodhound for calories. The fire has become your god, your companion, your reason for living. You talk to it like it's a person, coax it like it's a temperamental animal, worship it like it holds your soul, which in a very real sense it does. You've developed an almost supernatural ability to keep it burning with the absolute minimum fuel, feeding it twigs and scraps like you're performing communion with the forces that keep you alive. Standing up has become a carefully planned event. Your blood pressure, weakened by starvation, makes you dizzy whenever you change position too quickly. You've learned to rise slowly, hold on to things, pause between movements. Your body is operating on emergency power now, and sudden movements can cause complete system failures. Medieval people who died of starvation were often found sitting peacefully in chairs, having simply run out of energy to continue the basic act of living. You measure time differently now, not by hours or days, but by small survival victories. Successfully melting snow for water, managing to keep the fire alive through another night, finding a few more crumbs of bread in your empty food sack. These tiny accomplishments feel enormous because they represent continued existence in a world that seems determined to erase you. Your thoughts have become circular and obsessive. You find yourself repeating the same mental calculations over and over. How much food is left, how many days it might last, whether the storm will end in time. Your starving brain has locked onto these equations like a broken record, unable to move past them to think about anything else. This is your mind's way of trying to solve an unsolvable problem by sheer repetition, as if thinking about it hard enough will somehow create more food. This is how starvation kills, not with drama or sudden collapse, but with the slow, methodical shutdown of everything that makes you human. First your strength, then your clarity, then your hope, and finally your basic will to continue the exhausting work of staying alive. Your definition of food has expanded considerably in the last few days. Items that would have disgusted your well-fed former self now represent potential salvation. The leather strap you use to hang your water bucket, that's cowhide, technically meat. The tallow candles that provide your precious light, made from animal fat, definitely edible. Your belt, leather again, and right there within arm's reach. You're starting to look at your possessions the way a desperate person looks at everything, as potential calories wrapped in denial. You begin with the least horrible option, your candles. Tallow made from rendered animal fat was actually consumed during famines throughout medieval Europe. It tastes exactly like what it is, solidified grease with a texture somewhere between soap and butter that's gone very, very bad. You scrape small amounts off with your knife and let them melt in your mouth, trying not to think about the fact that you're literally eating candle wax. Your stomach accepts this offering with the enthusiasm of someone receiving a gift they didn't want but desperately need. The leather comes next. You start with thin strips cut from the edge of your belt, soaking them in the warm water near your fire until they become somewhat pliable. Medieval people called this hunger leather, and it was actually a documented famine food. You chew each piece for what feels like hours, working it like tough meat until your jaws ache, and you can finally swallow the fibres. It tastes like what you didn't imagine eating a shoe would taste like if shoes were also somehow disappointing on a spiritual level. Here's your disturbing medieval survival fact. During the siege of Paris in 885 AD, people systematically ate their way through every piece of leather in the city. Belts, shoes, book bindings, horse tack. Anything made from animal hide became potential sustenance. The chroniclers noted that people became connoisseurs of leather quality, with calf skin being preferred over horsehide. And everyone agreeing that boot leather was the absolute worst. You're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries of desperate people making impossible choices. You discover that hunger makes you creative in ways you never wanted to be. Those dried herbs hanging from your rafters, meant for seasoning. You brew them into a tea that provides warmth and the illusion of consuming something substantial. The bark from the firewood, you scrape it off and boil it, creating a bitter soup that fills your stomach even if it doesn't truly nourish you. Medieval peasants knew which tree barks were edible, birch, willow, elm, and which would kill you. You're operating on instinct and hope. Your mice problem has become your mice solution. Those small rodents that used to annoy you by getting into your grain stores are now potential protein sources. You fashion crude traps from pieces of wood and string, baiting them with crumbs you can't afford to spare. When you catch your first mouse, you stare at its tiny body for a long time before deciding that survival trumps squeamishness. Skinned and cooked over your precious fire, it provides maybe 2 bites of actual meat. 2 bites that taste better than anything you've ever eaten, because they represent life continuing for just a little bit longer. The psychological aspect of eating these things is almost worse than the physical. Each bite of leather, each sip of bark tea, each tiny mouse morsel is an admission that you've crossed another line you never thought you'd cross. You're no longer eating food, you're consuming anything that might contain calories, dignity be damned. Medieval chroniclers wrote about the shame of famine foods, the way people would hide when eating leather or bark, not from fear of being caught, but from the humiliation of having fallen so far. You start to understand why medieval people spoke of famine as a living entity, something that hunted you and played with you before finishing you off. Famine doesn't just take your food, it takes your choices, your standards, your sense of self. It forces you to become someone you don't recognize, someone who gnaws on boot leather and calls it dinner. Your body responds to these non-foods with mixed reviews. The tallow provides actual calories and your energy improves slightly for a few hours. The leather gives your stomach something to work on, creating the sensation of fullness even though it provides almost no nutrition. The bark and herbs warm you internally and seem to ease the constant stomach cramps, but your digestive system, evolved to process actual food, struggles with these substitutes. You experience cramping, nausea, and digestive distress that makes you wonder if you're poisoning yourself slowly in the name of staying alive. Sleep becomes even more elusive as your body tries to process these strange meals. You dream of real food constantly now, not just remembering meals from your past, but creating elaborate fantasies of fictional feasts. Your sleeping mind conjures the taste of roasted meat, fresh bread, sweet honey, ripe fruit. You wake up with your mouth watering and the crushing disappointment of reality. These dreams are so vivid that for a moment after waking you're confused about what's real. Did you actually eat that wonderful meal? Or are you still trapped in this frozen cottage with nothing but leather strips and mouse bones? You begin to understand the medieval concept of good death versus bad death. A good death was sudden, in battle or from illness, with your dignity intact. A bad death was slow starvation, where piece by piece you were forced to give up everything that made you human. You're living through the process of bad death, feeling yourself become something less than what you were, one desperate meal at a time. The irony isn't lost on you that in trying to stay alive, you're having to eat things that make you feel less alive. Each piece of leather, each desperate substitution for real food, takes something away from your humanity. You're staying breathing, but you're not staying yourself. Medieval people understood this trade-off intimately. Survival sometimes required becoming someone you couldn't live with, assuming you lived at all. Yet you keep eating these things because the alternative is giving up entirely. And somewhere in the back of your mind, beneath the shame and desperation, a small voice insists that this is temporary. That spring will come. That real food exists somewhere beyond this frozen hell. That voice gets quieter every day, but it's still there, whispering that all of this degradation might somehow be worth it if you can just hold on a little longer. Your mind has started playing tricks that feel less like tricks and more like alternate realities bleeding through the walls of your frozen cottage. You find yourself having full conversations with people who aren't there. Your sister who died 2 summers ago, the baker's boy who never returned from the plague years, even strangers you've invented from thin air. These conversations are so vivid, so real that you're shocked when you turn to offer them some of your precious warmth and find empty air instead. The hunger has evolved into something almost mystical. It's no longer just an empty feeling. It's become a presence, a companion, a voice that whispers suggestions you try very hard not to listen to. It tells you about the nutritional possibilities in things you know you shouldn't eat. It suggests that the wooden handle of your knife might have some caloric value if you could just chew it thoroughly enough. It's become the devil on your shoulder if the devil was trying to keep you alive through increasingly questionable means. You've developed what medieval physicians called famine sight, the ability to see food where none exists. A brown stain on the wall becomes a chunk of bread. Shadows cast by the firelight look like hanging meat. Even the grain in the wood of your table starts to resemble the texture of hardtack. Your brain, desperate for visual confirmation that sustenance exists somewhere in your environment, has begun interpreting every visual input as potential nourishment. Here's your medieval madness fact. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, chroniclers recorded people eating their own children, not out of malice, but from starvation-induced insanity that made them unable to distinguish between survival and horror. The human brain, deprived of glucose for extended periods, begins to make decisions that seem logical to its starved synapses, but are recognized as insane by any external observer. You haven't reached that point, but you can feel your moral compass spinning wildly as your body consumes your mind. Time has become elastic and unreliable. You'll sit down to tend the fire and suddenly realize hours have passed without you noticing. Or you'll feel like you've been awake for days, only to discover it's only been a few minutes since you last checked. Your starving brain can no longer maintain accurate temporal awareness, so you drift through moments like a ghost haunting your own life. You've started hoarding things that aren't hoardable. Small twigs from your firewood pile arranged in neat little stacks like they're precious treasures. Droplets of melted snow captured in your cupped palms, examined closely as if they contain secret messages. Your mind, unable to control your food supply, has redirected its hoarding instincts toward whatever small things it can organize and protect. It's the psychological equivalent of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, but it provides a tiny sense of control in a situation where you control absolutely nothing. The hallucinations have become more frequent and more elaborate. You see entire feasts spread across your small table: roasted fowl, fresh bread, wheels of cheese, flagons of ale. You can smell them, almost taste them, and for precious minutes you exist in a world where food is abundant and you are safe and warm and fed. Then reality crashes back like cold water, leaving you more devastated than before. These visions are your brain's attempt to provide relief from unbearable circumstances. But they're also torture of the cruelest kind. Your relationship with pain has fundamentally changed. The constant ache in your stomach, the cramping in your legs, the headaches, the joint pain from cold and malnutrition, they've all become background noise, like living next to a waterfall. You've adapted to existing in a state of continuous physical distress, and the absence of pain would now feel strange and alarming. This is what medieval people called the acceptance of suffering, and it was considered a spiritual achievement. You're achieving enlightenment through agony, one empty day at a time. You've begun talking to inanimate objects as if they were people, pets, or allies. Your fire has become old friend, and you address it directly. "I'm on, old friend. Just a little brighter tonight." Your water bucket is faithful companion. Your knife is sharp helper. This isn't just loneliness. It's your mind creating relationships wherever it can find them. desperate for any sense of connection in a world that's been reduced to you, your cottage, and the endless cold outside. Sleep and wake have blended into a continuous dream state where you're never entirely sure which reality you're occupying. You dream you're awake and tending the fire, then wake up to discover the fire has nearly died. You dream you're eating a wonderful meal, then wake up chewing on your own sleeve. The boundaries between conscious and unconscious thought have blurred because your brain lacks the energy to maintain clear distinctions between different states of awareness. Your hearing has become supernaturally acute for certain sounds, anything that might indicate food or danger, while simultaneously becoming deaf to everything else. You can hear a mouse scratching in the walls from across the room, but miss the sound of your own voice when you speak aloud. Your sensory equipment has been repurposed entirely for survival, filtering out everything except what might help you live another day. The strangest development is that you've started to feel oddly peaceful at times, even euphoric. This is your brain releasing endorphins to cope with extreme stress, creating moments of what medieval mystics called sacred suffering. You float in these brief periods of chemically induced serenity, feeling disconnected from your physical distress, almost enjoying the sensation of being reduced to pure consciousness, inhabiting a failing body. You understand now why medieval people believed in possession, in spirits that could inhabit and control human beings. Because you no longer feel like you're controlling your own thoughts, actions, or perceptions. Something else, hunger, madness, desperation, has moved into your mind and is operating the machinery of your consciousness. You're a passenger in your own body watching someone who looks like you, make increasingly strange decisions in the name of staying alive. This is how famine madness works, not as a sudden break from reality, but as a gradual sliding into an alternate world where the normal rules of thought and behavior no longer apply. You're still you, but you're also becoming someone else, someone shaped entirely by the mathematics of survival and the creativity of desperation. Your cottage has become a laboratory for extracting every possible degree of warmth from a hostile universe. You've spent hours studying the way cold moves through your space like water finding cracks, and you've developed countermeasures that would seem insane to anyone who wasn't slowly freezing to death. Every gap between wall logs has been stuffed with anything that might trap air. Rags, moss, even the stuffing from your pillow sacrificed to create tiny barriers against the wind that wants to steal your life one breath at a time. You've discovered that your body heat, pathetic as it feels, is actually a significant source of warmth if you can capture and redirect it properly. You've constructed what medieval people called a heat trap, using your blankets arranged like a tent around your chair by the fire. The small space created underneath captures and holds the warmth from both the flames and your own metabolism, creating a microclimate that's perhaps 10 degrees warmer than the rest of your cottage. It's like living in a fabric cave, but it's the difference between surviving and not surviving. The science of medieval heating was brutal and practical. You've learned to bank your fire at night, covering the coals with ash to slow their burning while keeping them alive until morning. This technique, passed down through generations of people who understood that letting your fire die completely was often a death sentence, allows you to preserve fuel while maintaining enough heat to prevent your water from freezing solid. You wake up every few hours to carefully stir the coals and add the smallest possible amount of fuel, like performing surgery on the source of your life. Here's your survival fact that medieval people learned through bitter experience. More people died from carbon monoxide poisoning than from cold during severe winters. Desperate families would seal their cottages so tightly against the cold that their fires would consume all available oxygen and fill their homes with deadly smoke. The choice became freezing to death or suffocating, and many chose wrong. You balance this knife edge carefully, maintaining just enough ventilation to stay conscious, while trapping as much heat as possible. Your clothing has evolved into a complex layering system that would impress modern Arctic explorers. Every piece of fabric you own has found a purpose. Wool closest to your skin to wick moisture, linen over that to create insulating layers, your heaviest cloak on the outside to break the wind. You've learned to stuff dry grass between the layers, creating pockets of trapped air that function as medieval insulation. You look like a scarecrow wearing the entire contents of a clothing chest, but you're warmer than you would be otherwise. You've begun burning things you never thought were flammable. Old rope unraveled into fibres burns hot and fast, perfect for quick warmth when you need to perform. Tasks requiring dexterity. The wax from your precious candles, when mixed with small twigs, creates flame that burns longer than wood alone. Even dried human waste, a survival technique so desperate that medieval people spoke of it in whispers, can be burned when mixed with straw, providing BTUs that might keep you alive another night. Your sleeping arrangement has become an engineering project designed to capture and hold every calorie of heat your body produces. You've created what amounts to a nest inside your bed, using layers of clothing, blankets, and even dried grass to create multiple insulation barriers. You sleep fully clothed, of course, but you've also learned to warm stones by the fire and wrap them in cloth to place against your core and extremities. Medieval people called these bed warmers, and they were the difference between waking up alive and not waking up at all. Water management has become a crucial survival skill. You've learnt to keep a small pot of water constantly simmering near the fire, not for drinking, but for the humidity it adds to your dangerously dry cottage air. This prevents your respiratory passages from cracking and bleeding in the cold, and it also adds a tiny amount of warmth to the atmosphere. Plus, the psychological comfort of seeing steam rise continuously provides the illusion that your environment is less hostile than it actually is. You've developed techniques for warming your extremities that would seem strange to modern people but made perfect sense to medieval survivors. You tuck your hands inside your clothing against your torso to warm them. You massage your feet regularly to maintain circulation. You've learnt the early warning signs of frostbite, the numbness, the waxy appearance of skin, the loss of sensation, and you respond immediately by warming affected areas gradually. Medieval people who lost fingers and toes to frostbite often died from the subsequent infections, so prevention was literally a matter of life and death. The psychological aspect of staying warm is almost as important as the physical techniques. You've created rituals around heat that provide mental comfort along with actual warmth. The ceremony of building up the fire each morning becomes a form of meditation. The process of warming your hands around a cup of hot water becomes a moment of gratitude. These small rituals give structure to days that would otherwise be formless struggles against cold and despair. You've learned to read your cottage like a book, understanding which corners trap cold air, which walls radiate the most heat from your fire, where drafts enter and how to redirect them. Your small space has become as familiar as your own body, and you move through it with the efficiency of someone who can't afford wasted motion or energy. Every step is calculated to maximize warmth retention and minimize exposure to the cold spots that lurk in shadows. Your breathing technique has adapted to conserve heat. You've learned to breathe through your nose to warm incoming air, to keep your mouth closed to prevent heat loss, to breathe shallow when necessary to avoid shocking your system with cold air. Medieval people understood that proper breathing was a survival skill, and they passed down techniques for maintaining body temperature through conscious control of respiration. The truly desperate measures have become routine. You've created a primitive sauna effect by heating stones in your fire, and then carefully moving them to a small enclosed space where you can sit and absorb their radiated heat. You've learned to exercise just enough to generate body heat without sweating, which would be deadly in this environment. You've even developed the ability to sleep in short bursts while maintaining fire-tending duties, catching rest without allowing your heat source to die. This is medieval engineering at its most basic and most crucial, the application of practical knowledge and desperate creativity to the simple problem of not freezing to death. Every technique you've developed represents generations of human wisdom accumulated through the harshest possible classroom, winter survival where failure meant death. Water has become your most dangerous necessity. You need it to live, but obtaining it requires burning precious fuel, and every log you use for melting snow is one less log keeping you from freezing to death. You've developed a careful mathematics of hydration versus hypothermia, calculating exactly how much water your body requires to function versus how much heat you can afford to sacrifice. The equation is always depressing, and the margins for error are measured in hours of potential survival. You've learnt that not all snow is created equal. Fresh, clean snow from the top of drifts requires less fuel to melt than the dirty, compacted snow at ground level. But reaching that good snow means opening your door, letting precious heat escape, and exposing yourself to wind that can steal your body warmth faster than you can replace it. Every trip outside to gather snow is a strategic mission planned like a military operation. Quick movement, minimal exposure, maximum efficiency. The process of melting snow has become a ritual of patience and precision. You place small amounts in your pot at a time, adding more only as the previous batch liquefies completely. Throwing too much snow in at once drops the temperature dramatically and wastes fuel as your fire struggles to heat the increased thermal mass. Medieval people learned this technique through bitter experience. The The difference between efficient snow melting and wasteful snow melting was often the difference between having fuel for the rest of the winter or running out before spring. Here's your medieval water fact that might save your life. Drinking melted snow without letting it warm to room temperature first can kill you through induced hypothermia. Your body has to use precious calories to warm that ice-cold water to body temperature, calories you probably don't have to spare. You've learned to let your melted snow sit near the fire until it's merely cool rather than frigid before drinking it. Every sip of cold water is a small theft from your body's energy reserves. You've developed techniques for maximizing the heat value of your melting operation. By keeping your water pot on the fire continuously, you create a system where you're always melting snow while simultaneously having warm water available for drinking. This efficient use of heat means one fire serves multiple purposes: warming your cottage, providing hot water for consumption, and melting your next day's supply. It's medieval multitasking where efficiency equals survival. The quality of water produced by melting snow has become a serious concern. Snowmelt tastes flat, lifeless, somehow empty in a way that makes you feel unsatisfied even when you've had enough to drink. This isn't imagination. Snow lacks the dissolved minerals that make regular water nourishing and satisfying. Your body craves these missing elements, leaving you perpetually thirsty even when you're technically hydrated. Medieval people tried to address this by adding small amounts of salt or herbs to their melted snow. But these precious commodities were often unavailable during siege-like winter conditions. You've learned to conserve water through techniques that would seem obsessive to well-hydrated people, but make perfect sense when every drop represents burned fuel. You reuse water for multiple purposes. Water used for washing your hands gets saved for the next day's cooking. Water used for cooking gets cooled and used for washing. Nothing gets wasted because waste equals death when your resources are measured in days rather than months. The psychological impact of water scarcity affects you in ways you didn't expect. You find yourself obsessing over every drop, calculating and recalculating your daily water needs, measuring your consumption like a miser counting coins. Thirst has joined hunger and cold as a constant background sensation, a low-level anxiety that reminds you continuously of your precarious situation. Medieval chroniclers noted that people under siege often became fixated on water in ways that seemed irrational to outside observers, but made perfect sense to anyone living on the edge of dehydration. Your urine has become a daily indicator of your hydration status and overall health. Dark, scanty urine tells you that your body is conserving every possible drop of water, concentrating waste products to dangerous levels. You've learned to judge your condition by the colour and frequency of urination, knowledge that medieval people considered essential for survival during hard times. When your urine becomes the colour of dark ale, you know you're approaching the point where dehydration begins to shut down your organs. You've discovered that melting snow creates its own microclimate in your cottage. The process adds humidity to air that's otherwise desert dry from constant heating, helping prevent your respiratory passages from cracking and bleeding. The steam rising from your melting pot provides psychological comfort as well as physical benefit, visible proof that warmth and life-giving water exist in your frozen world. You find yourself watching the steam rise with something approaching religious reverence. The timing of your water production has become crucial to your survival routine. You melt snow during the warmest part of the day when your fire can work most efficiently, then conserve that water carefully through the cold night hours. You've learned to judge exactly how much water you can produce without exhausting your fuel supply, a calculation that changes daily based on outside temperature, wind conditions, and the quality of snow available. Storage of your precious melted water presents its own challenges. Any container placed too far from the fire will allow your hard-won water to freeze again, forcing you to remelt it and waste additional fuel. But containers too close to the fire risk boiling away your water supply through evaporation. You've found the precise distance from your fire where water stays liquid but doesn't evaporate. A sweet spot measured in inches that represents the difference between hydration and dehydration. You've also learned the hard lesson about ice formation in containers. Water expands when it freezes, and you've lost more than one precious container to ice expansion cracking the sides. Medieval pottery wasn't designed to withstand freeze-thaw cycles, so you've developed techniques for preventing complete freezing even when fuel is desperately low, stirring containers regularly, adding small amounts of heated water to prevent complete solidification. This daily battle to maintain liquid water in a world determined to freeze everything solid has become the central challenge of your survival. Every successful day of having water to drink represents a victory against physics, weather, and the fundamental hostility of winter to human life. Every piece of burnable material in your cottage has been inventoried, categorized, and assigned a specific purpose in your carefully calculated fuel economy. You've become a scholar of combustion, understanding which materials burn hot and fast for quick warmth, which burn slow and steady for overnight heat, and which create the most light per unit of consumption. Your firewood pile, once a casual collection of logs, has become a carefully managed resource, where every stick is accounted for and every burning decision is weighed against future survival needs. You've learned to split your remaining wood into different categories based on their burning characteristics. Hardwoods like oak and ash burn slowly and produce steady heat, making them perfect for overnight fires when you need consistent warmth while sleeping. Softwoods, like pine, burn quickly and hot, ideal for rapid warming when you wake up shivering or need to melt snow efficiently. Kindling, small twigs and wood shavings, has become precious as currency because without it you can't start fires at all, making even the largest logs useless. The art of fire management has become your most critical survival skill. You've mastered the technique of banking coals, covering live embers with ash to slow their consumption while keeping them alive for hours without adding new fuel. This allows you to maintain a fire through the night using minimal wood, waking up to coals that can be blown back to flame rather than starting completely from scratch. Medieval people who couldn't master this technique often died on cold nights when their fires went completely dead. Here's your fuel conservation fact that separated medieval survivors from casualties: understanding the difference between heat and light. Most people waste fuel trying to illuminate their spaces brightly, but light produces very little warmth. You've learned to burn just enough fuel to create the heat you need for survival, accepting that your cottage will be dimly lit most of the time. Darkness doesn't kill you, cold does. This counterintuitive wisdom saved countless medieval lives during harsh winters. You've begun burning materials that your summer self would have considered either too valuable or inappropriate for fuel. Old clothing that can no longer be worn gets unraveled into threads that burn as kindling. Wooden tools that have broken get carefully disassembled, with each piece planned for specific burning purposes. Even dried food scraps, while painful to burn instead of eat, provide BTUs that might keep you alive when your conventional fuel runs out. Your burning schedule has become as regular and important as mealtimes once were. You burn hardwood during the day when you're awake and can tend the fire efficiently, switching to slower burning materials at night when you need consistent heat while sleeping. You've calculated exactly how much fuel is required to keep your cottage at survivable temperatures during different weather conditions, and you adjust your burning rate based on outside temperature and wind conditions. The psychological challenge of burning your remaining fuel is almost as difficult as the physical challenge of staying warm. Every log you feed to the flames brings you closer to the moment when you'll have no fuel left at all. You find yourself staring at your dwindling wood pile and doing the math over and over. If the storm lasts another week, will you have enough? If it lasts 2 weeks, the calculations always end the same way. You probably won't have enough, but you have to burn it anyway because the alternative is freezing to death tonight instead of next week. You've developed techniques for maximizing the heat output of each piece of fuel. Splitting logs into smaller pieces creates more surface area for burning, producing heat faster when you need quick warmth. But smaller pieces also burn faster, so you balance the need for immediate heat against the need to conserve fuel. You've learned to arrange logs in your fire to create the most efficient airflow, understanding that a properly built fire burns hotter and cleaner than a poorly constructed one. Scavenging for additional fuel has become a daily survival activity, even though options are severely limited by the storm conditions. You search your cottage repeatedly for anything that might burn. Old rope, cloth scraps, even the straw from your mattress. Each discovery feels like finding treasure, even though you know these materials will provide only minutes of additional warmth. The search itself has become a form of meditation, a way to feel like you're actively working towards survival rather than passively waiting to die. You've learned to judge the remaining energy content of partially burned wood, salvaging pieces from your fire that still have fuel value but have stopped burning efficiently. These charcoal remnants can be relit later and will burn hotter than fresh wood, though for shorter periods. Medieval people became experts at recycling fire materials, understanding that waste in fuel management was literally waste of life. The moisture content of your fuel has become a critical factor in your survival calculations. Wet wood burns poorly and produces more smoke than heat, wasting precious energy that could have kept you warm. You've learned to dry wood near your fire before burning it, but this process requires heat energy that you can barely afford to spend. The irony of using fuel to prepare fuel for more efficient burning represents the kind of impossible mathematics that define medieval winter survival. Your relationship with fire has evolved beyond simple heating into something approaching worship. You talk to your flames, coax them, promise them better fuel if they'll just burn a little longer. Fire has become your god, your companion, your hope and your terror all at once. When it burns bright, you feel hopeful. When it dims, you feel mortality creeping closer. Medieval people understood this relationship intimately. Fire was the boundary between life and death, and maintaining it was humanity's most ancient and most crucial skill. You've started planning for the inevitable moment when your conventional fuel runs out entirely. You've identified which pieces of your furniture might burn as emergency fuel, chairs, tables, even structural elements of your cottage if desperation demands it. The thought of burning your own shelter to stay warm represents the final phase of survival mathematics, where the choice becomes freezing to death in an intact cottage or living a few more days in a partially dismantled one. This daily management of fuel resources has taught you something profound about medieval life. People didn't die from single catastrophic events, but from the slow mathematics of attrition. Every day you survive is a small victory against the arithmetic of winter, but it's also one day closer to the inevitable moment when the numbers stop adding up in your favour. Your feet have stopped being feet and become distant relatives you occasionally hear news about through the primitive telegraph system of your nervous system. The messages they send are increasingly alarming. Tingling that feels like insects crawling under your skin, numbness that spreads from your toes upward like cold water filling a boot, and occasional sharp pains that remind you circulation still exists, though barely. You've taken to removing your shoes every few hours to examine your extremities, looking for the telltale signs of frostbite that mean you're losing parts of yourself to the winter piece by piece. Your hands shake continuously now, not just from cold or hunger, but from a nervous system that's running on fumes and making increasingly poor decisions about motor control. Simple tasks that once required no thought, lighting kindling, stirring your fire, even holding a cup, now demand careful planning and multiple attempts. You drop things constantly, watch precious items slip from fingers that no longer reliably follow your brain's instructions. Medieval people called this winter palsy, and they knew it meant your body was beginning the process of shutting down non-essential systems to preserve your core organs. Sleep has become a dangerous necessity rather than a comfort. You doze fitfully in your chair by the fire, wrapped in every piece of fabric you own, but you wake up every hour or two in a panic, convinced something terrible has happened. Sometimes you wake up to discover your fire has burned dangerously low. Sometimes you wake up with cold, your body's temperature has dropped enough to trigger survival reflexes. Worst of all, sometimes you wake up because you stopped breathing properly in your sleep, and your oxygen-starved brain jolted you back to consciousness. Here's your medieval mortality fact that explains why so many people died in their sleep during harsh winters. Hypothermia doesn't kill you dramatically. Your body temperature drops gradually, your heart rate slows, your breathing becomes shallow, and eventually you just don't wake up. Medieval people found neighbours who had simply failed to get up one morning, still sitting in their chairs, still technically in sleeping positions, but no longer alive. They called it winter sleep, and everyone understood it was the gentlest possible way to die, when all the alternatives were worse. Your digestive system has declared independence from your conscious control and is making executive decisions about what it will and won't process. The strange combinations of leather, tallow, bark, and occasional mouse that constitute your current diet have created a rebellion in your stomach that expresses itself through constant cramping, nausea, and digestive processes that seem to require more energy than they provide. Your body is spending precious calories trying to extract nutrition from materials that were never meant to be food. Breathing has become work in a way you never noticed when you had enough to eat and adequate warmth. Each inhalation requires conscious effort, and the cold air burns your throat and lungs like you're slowly drowning in ice water. You've developed a chronic cough that produces nothing but uses energy you can't spare. Medieval physicians would have diagnosed this as winter lung, understanding that cold air damages the delicate tissues of your respiratory system and that recovery requires warmth and nutrition you don't have access to. Your skin has become a battlefield where cold, malnutrition, and poor hygiene wage war against your body's attempts to maintain its protective barrier. Cracks appear at the corners of your mouth, around your knuckles, anywhere that movement stretches skin that's lost its elasticity. These small wounds don't heal properly because your body lacks the resources for repair, and they become entry points for infection in a world where even minor medical problems can become fatal. Memory has become unreliable in ways that would be frightening if you had the mental energy to be properly frightened. You forget what you were doing mid-task. You lose track of whether you've eaten today or yesterday or at all. You find yourself staring at objects in your cottage without being able to remember their purpose or how you acquired them. Your starving brain is jettisoning non-essential information to conserve energy for basic life functions, which means your sense of identity is literally being consumed to keep you breathing. Your eyes have adapted to the dim light of your cottage, but they've developed problems that suggest your body is cannibalizing itself in systematic ways. Night blindness makes it difficult to navigate even your familiar space in darkness. Dry eyes create constant irritation because your body has stopped producing tears. It considers a waste of precious fluids. Sometimes you see flashing lights or dark spots that aren't there, signs that your visual system is malfunctioning due to nutritional deficiencies. Temperature regulation has become a constant crisis that your body handles with increasingly poor judgment. You feel overheated when you're actually dangerously cold, a sign that your internal thermostat has broken under the stress of prolonged hypothermia. You remove clothing when you should be adding it, driven by confused nerve signals that interpret extreme cold as heat. Medieval people learned to recognize this symptom in others because the person experiencing it couldn't recognize it in themselves. Your joints have become weather prediction systems that unfortunately only predict bad weather. Knees, elbows, and shoulders ache constantly from the combination of cold and malnutrition. Movement becomes painful, then difficult, then, eventually, something you avoid whenever possible. But avoiding movement means losing muscle mass and circulation, which means getting colder faster, which means needing more fuel to stay warm. Your body has trapped you in a cycle where every attempt to conserve energy makes you need more energy. The strangest betrayal is that your sense of smell has become supernaturally acute for certain odours while going completely dead to others. You can detect the faintest possibility of food from impossible distances, but you can no longer smell your own body odour or the staleness of your living space. Your sensory equipment has been repurposed entirely for survival, filtering everything through the question of whether it might help you find calories or avoid danger. Your heartbeat has become irregular and weak, something you notice because the silence in your cottage makes every bodily sound audible. Sometimes it races for no apparent reason, making you feel anxious and exhausted simultaneously. Sometimes it seems to skip beats entirely, creating moments of panic where you wonder if it will start again. Medieval people understood that a weak heart was both a symptom of starvation and a cause of death, but they had no treatments beyond prayer and hope. This systematic failure of your physical systems isn't dramatic or sudden. It's a gradual process of your body making calculated decisions about which parts of you are essential for immediate survival and which can be sacrificed. You're not dying all at once. You're dying a little bit at a time, in carefully managed installments that your body hopes will allow you to survive just long enough for conditions to improve. Your body has become a desperate accountant, liquidating assets in order of importance to keep the vital operations running just one more day. First, it consumed the obvious reserves, your fat stores, your easily accessible muscle mass, even the glycogen stored in your liver. Now it's moved on to more essential infrastructure, breaking down the proteins in your heart muscle, your kidneys, your brain tissue itself. You can feel this happening, not as pain exactly, but as a gradual sense of your own substance diminishing, like a candle that's burning from both ends. The muscle wasting has accelerated to the point where your clothes hang on you like fabric draped over a scarecrow frame. Your legs, once strong enough to work long days in the fields, now tremble with the effort of standing up from your chair. Your arms struggle to lift pieces of firewood that would have felt weightless a month ago. Medieval physicians called this the Great Wasting, understanding that when the body began consuming its own structural elements, death was measuring time in weeks rather than months. Your immune system has essentially shut down operations, leaving you vulnerable to infections that your healthy body would have fought off without you even noticing. A small cut on your finger has become an angry red, wound that refuses to heal. Your gums bleed when you eat, and you can feel your teeth loosening in their sockets as your body pulls calcium from non-essential bones to keep your heart functioning. Every minor physical insult becomes a potential fatal problem when your body lacks the resources to repair itself. Here's the brutal biology fact that medieval people learned through observation. Your body will sacrifice your sanity to preserve your circulation. As your brain tissue is consumed for energy, your thinking becomes increasingly irrational, but your heart keeps beating. Your memories disappear, but your breathing continues. Your personality dissolves, but your blood keeps flowing to your vital organs. You're becoming less yourself every day in order to remain technically alive. The process isn't random. Your body is following an ancient protocol developed over millions of years of evolution, systematically shutting down systems based on their immediate importance to survival. Your reproductive system shut down weeks ago, correctly concluding that having children is irrelevant when you're unlikely to survive the winter. Your hair has stopped growing, redirecting those resources to more essential functions. Even your nails have become brittle and slow-growing as your body decides that grooming is a luxury for people who aren't actively dying. Your kidneys are working overtime to process the waste products created by your body consuming itself, but they're also being consumed themselves in the process. Your urine has become increasingly dark and decreased in volume as your body desperately conserves every drop of fluid, while simultaneously trying to eliminate the toxic byproducts of starvation. Medieval people understood that when someone stopped urinating entirely, death followed within days. Sleep has become dangerous because your metabolic rate drops during rest, and your compromised circulatory system can't maintain adequate blood flow to your extremities while you're unconscious. You wake up with hands and feet that have gone completely numb, requiring painful minutes of massage to restore sensation. Sometimes you wake up and can't feel your lips or cheeks, signs that your face was approaching frostbite while you slept. Your body temperature regulation system has become completely unreliable, swinging between dangerous extremes without warning. You'll feel burning hot and start to remove clothing only to realize minutes later that you're actually hypothermic, and your confused nervous system was giving you exactly the wrong signals. Medieval people learned to judge each other's condition by touch, rather than by what the person claimed to be feeling, because starvation made internal temperature sensing completely untrustworthy. The psychological effects of your body consuming your brain tissue are becoming more pronounced and more frightening. You find yourself making decisions that seem perfectly logical in the moment but are obviously insane in retrospect. You spend precious energy rearranging objects that don't need arranging. You have conversations with people who've been dead for years. You become convinced that solutions exist to problems that are actually unsolvable. This isn't mental illness. It's the direct result of malnutrition, destroying the neural pathways responsible for rational thought. Your digestive system has become so compromised that even if food were available, your body might not be able to process it effectively. The lining of your stomach has deteriorated to the point where eating normal food could actually damage you further. Your liver, partially consumed by your body's desperate need for protein, can no longer filter toxins effectively. You're approaching the point where rescue itself could be fatal if not managed carefully by someone who understands refeeding syndrome. The strangest aspect of this systematic self-destruction is that your body is still trying to protect you. It's making calculated sacrifices, burning everything non-essential to keep your heart, lungs, and core brain functions operational just a little bit longer. Your body is hoping that spring will come, that rescue will arrive, that somehow the external conditions will change before the internal resources are completely exhausted. It's gambling your future health against your immediate survival. Your nervous system has begun shutting down peripheral functions to concentrate on core operations. You've lost sensation in your extremities not just from cold, but from nerve damage caused by malnutrition. Your reflexes have slowed dramatically, and your coordination has deteriorated to the point where simple tasks require intense concentration. Medieval people recognized these signs as indicators that someone was entering the final stages of starvation. Even your blood has become a strategic resource that your body manages carefully. Your circulation has slowed and become shallow, concentrating on keeping vital organs perfused while allowing less essential tissues to become oxygen-starved. Your skin has taken on a greyish pallor, and your nail beds have turned blue, visible signs that your cardiovascular system is in crisis mode. This is the final phase of your body's survival strategy. Controlled demolition of everything non-essential to maintain basic life functions for as long as possible. Your body is burning itself as fuel, hoping against hope that external salvation will arrive before internal resources are completely exhausted. It's a desperate gamble played with the currency of your own flesh, and the odds are not in your favour. Your nervous system has entered a state of complete confusion where the most basic sensory information can no longer be trusted. You find yourself removing your cloak because you feel unbearably hot, then moments later realising you're actually dangerously cold and your skin has taken on the bluish tint that means your circulation is failing. This isn't simple confusion, it's paradoxical undressing, a sign that your hypothermic brain is interpreting the shutdown of peripheral circulation as overheating. Medieval people learned to recognise this symptom in others because the person experiencing it couldn't recognise it in themselves. Your sense of pain has become completely unreliable, delivering information that ranges from false alarms to dangerous segments. Injuries that should hurt intensely barely register, while areas of your body that appear unharmed send constant signals of agony. You've burned yourself on your firepot multiple times because the nerve damage in your hands prevents you from feeling dangerous heat until actual tissue damage has occurred. Conversely, you experience excruciating pain in your feet that have no visible injuries, phantom agony created by a nervous system that's malfunctioning under extreme stress. Touch sensations have become surreal and disconnected from reality. Sometimes your skin feels like it's crawling with insects that aren't there. Other times you lose all tactile sensation entirely, handling objects without being able to feel their texture, temperature, or weight. Most disturbing of all, you occasionally feel like you're touching things when your hands are empty or fail to feel objects you're actually holding. Your brain is filling in missing sensory information with hallucinations, creating a reality that exists only inside your damaged neural pathways. Here's your neurological survival fact that medieval people observed but couldn't explain. Severe hypothermia creates a condition where your brain literally begins to shut down from the outside in, starting with complex reasoning and working toward basic life functions. The confusion about temperature is one of the early signs that your higher brain functions are being sacrificed to keep your brainstem operational. People in the final stages of freezing to death often remove all their clothing because they feel desperately overheated. A cruel irony that medieval people called the devil's fever. Your vision has developed problems that suggest your optical system is failing in systematic ways. You see movement in your peripheral vision that isn't there, shadows that dart just outside your direct sight, shapes that dissolve when you turn to look at them directly. Sometimes you see people in your cottage who vanish when you blink, so realistic that you speak to them before realising you're alone. Your starving, oxygen-deprived brain is creating visual information to fill the gaps left by damaged neural pathways. Temperature sensations have become completely divorced from actual temperature, creating a dangerous disconnect between what your body is experiencing and what your brain thinks is happening. You'll feel comfortably warm while your water bucket freezes solid next to you. You'll feel chilled to the bone while sitting directly next to your fire, close enough that your clothing could ignite. This sensory chaos makes it impossible to judge your actual condition or make rational decisions about warming strategies. Your hearing has developed strange distortions that make your cottage feel haunted by the sounds that probably don't exist. You hear voices calling your name from outside, footsteps on your roof knocking on your door. When you investigate, you find nothing but wind and snow. Your auditory system, damaged by poor circulation and malnutrition, is manufacturing sounds from the random neural noise created by dying nerve cells. Medieval people believed these phantom sounds were spirits of the dead calling to the living, but they were actually symptoms of a brain consuming itself. Balance and spatial orientation have become unreliable to the point where you occasionally feel like your cottage is tilting or spinning, even though you know it's solidly built and motionless. You reach for objects that appear to be within grasp, but turn out to be much farther away or much closer than they looked. Your inner ear, responsible for balance and spatial awareness, is malfunctioning due to poor circulation and nutritional deficiencies, making your own living space feel like foreign territory. The sensation of hunger itself has become perverted into something that resembles satisfaction. Your empty stomach sends signals that your confused brain interprets as fullness, leading to moments where you feel like you've just eaten a large meal despite having consumed nothing but melted snow and leather scraps for days. This phantom satiation is your nervous system's attempt to shut down the psychological torture of constant hunger by simply lying to your conscious mind about your condition. Your sense of time has warped beyond recognition, not just in terms of duration, but in terms of sequence and causality. You find yourself trying to tend fires that you haven't built yet, or checking food stores that you've already consumed. Past, present, and future blend together in your confused consciousness, creating a temporal landscape where cause and effect become meaningless concepts. You live in an eternal present where nothing quite makes sense and nothing quite follows logically from anything else. Most frightening of all, you've begun to lose the ability to distinguish between your internal mental state and external reality. Thoughts feel like conversations with other people. Memories feel like current events. Dreams feel more real than waking experience. The boundary between your inner consciousness and the outside world has become permeable, creating a psychological landscape where anything might be true and nothing can be trusted. Your emotional responses have become completely inappropriate to actual circumstances, swinging wildly between extremes that have no connection to what's actually happening. You feel euphoric while examining your dwindling fuel supply. You feel devastated while successfully melting snow for water. Your emotional regulation system, located in parts of your brain that are being consumed for energy, no longer provides useful information about your circumstances or appropriate responses to challenges. Physical sensations arrive with significant delays, creating dangerous situations where you're injured or endangered, but don't realize it until much later. You burn yourself and don't feel it for several minutes. You cut yourself and don't notice until you see the blood. This sensory lag means you're constantly operating with outdated information about your body's condition, making it impossible to protect yourself from ongoing damage. This complete breakdown of sensory reliability means you can no longer trust any information your body provides about your condition, your environment, or your needs. You're flying blind through a survival situation where accurate information is literally the difference between life and death. But your information systems have been compromised beyond repair by the very conditions you're trying to survive. Your broken knife handle has become more valuable than silver coins ever were, because silver coins can't start fires or scrape ice from your water bucket, or defend you from the rats that have grown bold in their own hunger. The entire concept of value has been inverted in your frozen cottage, where worth is measured not in monetary terms but in immediate utility towards staying alive another day. A single strip of leather torn from your belt is worth more than a lord's ring because you can eat leather, even if it tastes like despair seasoned with the ghosts of dead cattle. You've developed a complex internal economy where every possession is constantly evaluated and re-evaluated based on its potential contribution to survival. Your wooden spoon could be kindling if you get desperate enough for fire. Your extra tunic could be shredded into strips for patching holes in your walls. Even your straw mattress stuffing has become potential fuel for your fire, though sleeping on bare wooden boards in winter cold would probably kill you faster than the extra warmth would save you. Every object exists in quantum states of usefulness, simultaneously being what it is and what it could become if necessity demands transformation. The mathematics of desperation don't follow normal rules of logic or long-term thinking. You find yourself calculating the caloric value of your leather belt versus its utility for holding your clothing together, weighing the immediate energy of burning your spare cloth against the future protection it provides from cold. These equations have no right answers, only less wrong ones, and every choice involves sacrificing something essential to preserve something equally essential. Here's your medieval economics fact that explains how entire social systems collapse during extreme winters. When survival becomes the only currency, normal concepts of ownership, law, and social contract become meaningless. People would steal food from neighbours who were also starving, not out of malice but out of simple mathematics. Your neighbour's loaf of bread represents 3 more days of life for you, while your moral obligation to respect their property represents abstract philosophical concepts that don't burn in fires or fill empty stomachs. You've begun hoarding things that have no intrinsic value but might become precious if circumstances change. Small twigs that fell from your firewood are collected and saved like gems. Scraps of food too small to constitute a meal are preserved against some future moment of even greater desperation. Drops of tallow that fall from your burning candle are captured and saved because tallow is both light source and emergency food. You're saving everything because you can no longer predict what might become the difference between life and death. The concept of waste has been completely eliminated from your existence. Water used for cooking gets reused for washing. Ash from your fire gets saved for cleaning and for adding to food as a source of minerals your body desperately needs. Even your own waste products get repurposed. Urine for tanning leather in case you need to eat it. Human waste for fertilizer if you survive until spring planting. Nothing gets discarded because everything might have value you haven't discovered yet. Your relationship with time has been monetized in ways that would seem insane to anyone not facing imminent death. You spend energy like coins from a purse that's nearly empty, calculating whether the effort of walking across your cottage to retrieve something is worth the calories the movement will cost. Every action requires a cost-benefit analysis, where the benefits are measured in minutes of extended survival, and the costs are measured in irreplaceable energy reserves. Bartering has become internal negotiation between different aspects of your survival needs. Your hunger negotiates with your need for warmth about whether to burn something edible for fuel or eat something flammable for calories. Your short-term survival needs argue with your long-term planning about whether to consume resources quickly for immediate relief or ration them for potential extended crisis. You've become a marketplace where different biological imperatives compete for limited resources. The psychology of scarcity has created behaviors that would appear obsessive-compulsive to outside observers, but make perfect sense within the logic of survival. You count and recount your remaining food, not because the numbers change, but because the act of counting provides an illusion of control over uncontrollable circumstances. You organize and reorganize your possessions, creating order in the one small space where you still have agency. Risk assessment has been reduced to immediate binary choices. Will this action increase or decrease my chances of being alive tomorrow morning? Complex moral reasoning, long-term planning, social obligations, all have been swept aside by the brutal simplicity of survival mathematics. You would steal from your neighbor if you knew they had food. You would abandon a stranger in need if helping them endangered your own survival. These aren't moral fadings. They're adaptive behaviors demanded by circumstances where altruism equals suicide. Your cottage has become a fortress where everything must serve multiple purposes because single-purpose items are luxuries you can't afford. Your water bucket also serves as a chamber pot when going outside would mean death by exposure. Your eating spoon doubles as a tool for tending your fire. Your blanket functions as clothing, bedding, and emergency windbreak. Specialization has given way to desperate versatility. The strangest aspect of this survival economy is how it has taught you to find value in degradation itself. The progressive consumption of your possessions, your environment, even your own body, represents a kind of wealth because it's buying you time. Each day you survive by burning something irreplaceable is a successful transaction in the marketplace of mortality. You're liquidating your entire existence one piece at a time, hoping that external circumstances will change before your internal resources are completely exhausted. You've learned to think like a pawnshop owner, constantly evaluating what you own in terms of what it could be traded for if circumstances were different. Your metal knife could be bartered for food if there was anyone to trade with. Your wooden furniture could be sold for firewood if there was a market for it. But in your isolated cottage, you are both merchant and customer in an economy where the only commodity that matters is continued breathing. This transformation of everything into potential survival resources has changed not just your behavior, but your fundamental understanding of what constitutes wealth. Richness is no longer about accumulation, but about having options when desperate choices must be made. Poverty isn't about lacking money. It's about having consumed all your alternatives and facing death with empty hands. Every day you make choices that cost you pieces of your humanity, small moral compromises that seem insignificant individually, but accumulate into a fundamental change in who you are. You've started eyeing the neighbour's cottage not with concern for their welfare, but with calculations about what useful items might be inside if they don't survive the winter. This isn't malice. It's practical planning in a world where sentimentality is a luxury that kills people. But each time you think this way, you feel something essential inside you growing smaller and colder. You caught a mouse yesterday and hesitated for several long minutes before killing it, not because you felt squeamish about taking a life, but because you were calculating whether its tiny body contained enough protein to justify ending its existence. The fact that you had this internal debate that you weighed the mathematical value of a living creature against your caloric needs represents a transformation you wouldn't have thought possible months ago. Medieval people called this famine thinking, and they understood it was necessary for survival but poisonous to the soul. Your dreams have started featuring food you know you can't have, but lately they've evolved into something more disturbing. scenarios where you have enough food but choose not to share it with people who are starving. In these dreams, you hoard resources while watching others die, and you feel relief rather than guilt. You wake up wondering if these dreams represent your subconscious preparing you for choices you'll have to make, or warnings about choices you've already made without fully acknowledging them. Here's your moral survival fact that medieval chroniclers recorded but rarely discussed. Prolonged starvation doesn't just change what people do, it changes what they're capable of feeling empathy for. When your own survival is measured in days, the suffering of others becomes abstract, theoretical, less real than the immediate pain in your own stomach. This isn't callousness. It's a neurological adaptation that allows people to make impossible choices without being paralyzed by compassion that serves no practical purpose. You've stopped praying not because you've lost faith exactly, but because your prayers have become increasingly selfish requests for personal survival rather than broader appeals for mercy or justice. You can't spare the emotional energy to care about anyone else's welfare when your own is so precarious. This spiritual narrowing feels like a form of moral starvation that mirrors your physical condition. Your capacity for caring about anything beyond immediate survival has atrophied from disuse. The social contracts that once governed your behavior have dissolved under the pressure of necessity. You would steal from a friend if they had food and you were dying. You would lie to neighbours about your own resources to prevent them from asking for help you can't afford to give. You would abandon someone in need if helping them endangered your own survival. These realizations don't shock you anymore, which might be the most shocking thing of all. Your relationship with truth has become instrumental rather than moral. You evaluate statements not based on their accuracy, but on their usefulness for survival. You lie to yourself about how much food you have left, how long your fuel will last, how likely you are to survive until spring. These aren't delusions, they're strategic self-deceptions that prevent despair from becoming so overwhelming that you give up entirely. Truth has become another luxury you can't afford when reality is too harsh to face directly. The concept of dignity has been systematically sacrificed to the requirements of staying alive. You eat things that disgust you, you smell terrible, and don't care. You relieve yourself in containers because going outside would risk death by exposure. You talk to imaginary companions because the alternative is complete social isolation that could drive you insane. Each compromise with dignity is a small payment toward continued existence, but the accumulated cost is becoming someone you might not recognize if you met them in better circumstances. Your capacity for future planning has contracted to a window of perhaps days or hours, because longer-term thinking requires resources you need for immediate survival. You can't afford to care about what kind of person you'll be if you survive this winter, only about whether you'll survive it at all. This temporal myopia is protective. It prevents you from being overwhelmed by the magnitude of what you're losing, but it also means you're making decisions without considering their long-term consequences for your character. The social emotions that once motivated much of your behavior, shame, guilt, embarrassment, pride, have been largely suspended because they serve no survival function and consume energy you need for staying alive. You feel no shame about eating leather or talking to yourself or living in squalor. These emotional responses have been temporarily shut down like non-essential systems in a failing spacecraft, preserved for later restoration if you survive to have a later. You've discovered that compassion itself has limits, and yours have been reached and exceeded. You feel nothing when you imagine neighbours dying in their cottages. You experience no guilt about consuming resources that could theoretically help others. You've learnt that empathy is an energy-intensive emotion that your starving brain can no longer afford to maintain. This emotional numbing protects you from being destroyed by awareness of suffering you can't alleviate, but it also represents a fundamental change in your psychological architecture. The most disturbing realization is that these changes don't feel abnormal anymore. They feel like rational adaptations to circumstances that demand them. You're becoming someone who could survive situations that would destroy your former self, but the person who survives might bear little resemblance to the person who entered this crisis. You're trading humanity for continued existence, and the exchange rate seems to favour survival over soul. Your moral reasoning has been streamlined into simple binary calculations. Does this action increase or decrease my chances of survival? Complex ethical frameworks, social obligations, religious teachings, all have been simplified into immediate pragmatic concerns. You're not immoral, you've become immoral, operating in a space where traditional concepts of right and wrong have been suspended by necessity. This systematic reduction of moral complexity into survival mathematics represents perhaps the greatest cost of extreme circumstances, not just what they take from your body or your possessions, but what they take from your essential human nature. You're learning to survive, but you're also learning to become someone who can live with the choices survival demands. The fantasy starts small and reasonable. You imagine finding a forgotten sack of grain hidden in someone's abandoned cottage, a legitimate discovery that harms no one because the original owners are clearly beyond needing it. But the fantasy evolves quickly into scenarios that your moral former self would have found repulsive. You imagine taking food from neighbours who are also starving, justifying it with calculations about who's more likely to survive anyway. You imagine scenarios where helping someone else die faster would mean their resources could keep you alive longer. These aren't plans, not yet, but they're rehearsals, mental preparations for choices you hope you'll never have to make. The thought of warm bread has become a form of torture more exquisite than any physical pain you've experienced. You can smell it in your imagination so clearly that you sometimes look around your cottage expecting to find a loaf cooling nearby. The phantom sensation is so powerful that you salivate, which wastes precious moisture your body can't afford to lose. You've started to understand why medieval people spoke of gluttony as one of the deadly sins, not because eating was wrong, but because the desire for food could drive people to commit acts that destroyed their souls along with their bodies. You've caught yourself planning elaborate heists to steal food that probably doesn't exist from people who are likely already dead. You mentally map the cottages in your village, remembering which families seemed well provisioned before the storm, calculating which houses would be easiest to break into, planning routes that would minimize exposure to the cold. The fact that you're devoting mental energy to these criminal fantasies rather than useful survival activities demonstrates how hunger has begun to hijack your rational thinking processes. Here's your psychological survival fact that medieval confession records reveal. People facing starvation often experienced intrusive thoughts about cannibalism long before they faced actual situations where it became an option. These mental rehearsals weren't signs of moral corruption, but rather your brain's attempt to prepare you for decisions that might become necessary for survival. Medieval priests learned to distinguish between thoughts born of desperation and thoughts born of evil, understanding that extreme circumstances created mental states that had no relevance to normal moral judgment. The mathematics become increasingly specific and disturbing. You estimate how many additional days you could survive on your neighbour's remaining food stores. You calculate the caloric value of different parts of various animals, including animals that aren't typically considered food sources. You find yourself evaluating every living thing in terms of its potential contribution to your survival, from the mice in your walls to the neighbour's cat that occasionally passes by your window. This isn't bloodthirsty thinking, it's the desperate accounting of someone whose brain has been reprogrammed by starvation to see everything as potential fuel. You've started making conditional bargains with forces you're not even sure you believe in. What would you promise God or the devil or abstract fate in exchange for one substantial meal? The answers that occur to you are increasingly extreme. You'd promise to give up years of your life for one day of feeling full. You'd accept physical torture if it came with adequate food. You'd condemn strangers to suffer your current fate if it meant you could escape it. These bargains reveal how thoroughly hunger has rearranged your value system. The concept of rationing has evolved into increasingly desperate mathematics, where you calculate not just how to make food last longer, but how little you can eat and still maintain the strength needed to acquire more food through whatever means necessary. You're not just managing current resources, you're optimizing your decline to maximize your capability for increasingly desperate actions. You need enough strength left to break into cottages, to take things from other people, to do whatever survival might demand. Your dreams about food have become interactive fantasies where you negotiate with imaginary suppliers, offering services or possessions or parts of yourself in exchange for sustenance. In these dreams, you sell your memories, your personality traits, your relationships, anything intangible that might have value to entities capable of providing nourishment. You wake up from these dreams wondering if some of these bargains might be real, if desperation has opened channels to powers that trade in different currencies than normal commerce recognizes. The social taboos around eating have completely dissolved in your mind, replaced by purely practical considerations. You no longer think of foods as appropriate or inappropriate, only as available or unavailable. Pets, vermin, carrion, things that died of disease. Your internal categorization system has been simplified to edible versus inedible, with the boundary between those categories shifting daily based on your increasing desperation. You understand now why siege records include such disturbing accounts of what people consumed when normal food sources disappeared. You've begun to see other people primarily as potential allies or obstacles in your quest for calories rather than as individuals with their own inherent worth and rights. Your neighbour becomes either someone who might share resources with you, or someone who might compete with you for resources that could mean the difference between life and death. This utilitarian view of human relationships represents a fundamental shift from social thinking to survival thinking, from community membership to individual competition. The most disturbing realization is that you've started to feel entitled to other people's food if you believe you'd make better use of it than they would. If your neighbour is older, sicker, less likely to survive anyway, doesn't their food logically belong to someone who could put it to better use? This isn't malicious thinking. It's the application of harsh practical logic to situations where normal moral frameworks provide no guidance for impossible choices. You find yourself practicing conversations where you convince others to share their food with you, developing increasingly sophisticated arguments about fairness, necessity, and mutual benefit. But underneath these rehearsed social interactions, you're also practicing scenarios where convincing doesn't work, where persuasion fails, where taking what you need might require force or deception, or simply waiting for weakness to create opportunity. The person planning these actions doesn't feel like the person you were before this crisis began. You're inhabited by someone else, someone whose moral reasoning has been streamlined by necessity into forms your former self wouldn't recognize. But this new person might be the only one capable of making the choices that could keep your body alive long enough to see spring. The snow outside has reached your windowsill, and continues climbing like a slow-motion avalanche determined to bury your cottage completely under its white weight. What started as a storm has evolved into something more permanent and more sinister, a gradual process of burial that threatens to entomb you alive in your own home. You can no longer see out any window, which means you're effectively underground, sealed in a tomb made of frozen water that grows thicker and heavier with each passing hour. Your cottage creaks and groans under the accumulating load, in ways that remind you of a ship in distress, wooden beams and joints protesting against forces they were never designed to withstand. Medieval buildings weren't engineered for snow loads this extreme, and you can hear your shelter slowly surrendering to physics. Each new groan from the rafters could be the sound of your roof preparing to collapse, which would mean instant death from crushing or gradual death from exposure, depending on how catastrophically the structure fails. The weight of snow has begun to affect the very geometry of your living space. Doors stick in their frames as the walls shift under pressure. Windows refuse to open, sealed shut by the deformation of their wooden frames. Your cottage is being slowly compressed around you like a vice, and you realise with growing horror that even if you survive hunger and cold, you might be crushed or trapped by the very shelter that's supposed to protect you from the elements. Here's your architectural death fact that medieval chroniclers recorded with disturbing frequency. Cottage roof collapse was a leading cause of winter mortality during severe snow years. People would be found in spring, perfectly preserved by cold but flattened under the weight of their own homes. The irony was particularly cruel. Survivors of starvation and freezing temperatures killed by the snow load on structures that had protected them through the worst of the winter weather. The psychological impact of being completely buried alive while still conscious is unlike anything you've experienced before. You're entombed but not dead, sealed away from the world but still desperately clinging to life. The absolute silence outside your cottage is more complete than death itself. No wind sounds, no animal noises, no indication that a world still exists beyond the white void that has swallowed everything you've ever known. You exist in a pocket of barely living consciousness, surrounded by cubic yards of frozen water that could be your sarcophagus. Your water supply situation has become paradoxically desperate, despite being surrounded by more frozen water than you could melt in a lifetime. The snow pressed against your cottage is too compacted and dirty to use, contaminated with debris from roofs, branches, and whatever else the storm has swept up and deposited against your walls. You need the clean snow from the surface, but the surface is now several feet above your roofline, making it impossible to access even if you could somehow dig your way out. The air quality inside your cottage has begun to deteriorate as the snow creates an increasingly airtight seal around your living space. Carbon dioxide from your breathing and smoke from your fire have nowhere to escape, creating a slowly toxic atmosphere that makes you drowsy and confused. Medieval people didn't understand the science of air circulation, but they learned through tragic experience that sealed spaces killed people in ways that seemed mysterious until someone discovered the bodies in their perfectly intact, snow-buried cottages. Your fire has become a more complex survival challenge, because smoke that once escaped through your chimney now gets trapped and backed up by the snow load pressing against your roof. You're forced to burn smaller fires that produce less smoke, but smaller fires provide less heat, creating a deadly balance between immediate warmth and gradual carbon monoxide poisoning. Every fire management decision becomes a choice between different ways of dying. The snow's insulating properties work against you as much as they work for you, creating a situation where your cottage becomes a sealed container that traps both heat and toxic gases. While the snow barrier does help retain some warmth, it also prevents any air circulation that could bring fresh oxygen or remove dangerous accumulations of smoke and carbon dioxide. You're living in an increasingly poisonous bubble that could kill you quietly while protecting you from the cold that would kill you loudly. Escape has become theoretically impossible even if you wanted to attempt it. The snow depth outside your cottage means that opening any door would simply result in tons of snow cascading into your living space, eliminating your shelter while providing no practical path to freedom. You're trapped not by locked doors or physical restraints, but by the simple physics of snow depth that makes movement in any direction equivalent to digging through a collapsed mineshaft. The temporal aspect of your entombment is perhaps the most psychologically crushing element of your situation. You have no way to judge whether this snow accumulation represents a temporary extreme that will melt in days, or a permanent change that will last until spring. Medieval weather patterns were unpredictable even to people who lived through them, and you have no historical precedent for conditions this severe or this sustained. Your relationship with light has become desperate as the snow blocks all natural illumination, making your cottage interior darker than a cave. You're forced to burn precious tallow and oil just to see what you're doing, but these resources are also needed for heat, creating another impossible choice between conflicting survival needs. You're living in perpetual twilight that could last for weeks or months, depending on weather patterns completely beyond your control. The psychological pressure of knowing that rescue is impossible until spring creates a form of despair different from simple hunger or cold. Even if neighbours survived in other cottages, they're as trapped and helpless as you are. Even if authorities wanted to provide relief, they couldn't reach you through snow depths that have made transportation impossible. You're more isolated than if you were alone on a desert island, because at least desert islands exist under open sky. Your cottage has become a countdown timer measuring the race between your resource depletion and seasonal change. Every log burned, every scrap of food consumed, every day survived brings you closer to either salvation through spring melt or death through resource exhaustion. You're trapped in a white prison where the sentence is indefinite, and the only possible pardons come from forces completely beyond human control. The silence outside your buried cottage has evolved beyond simple quiet into something that feels actively hostile, a presence that presses against your consciousness like physical weight. It's not the peaceful silence of a calm night or the restful quiet of a library. It's the silence of the grave, complete and suffocating and wrong, in ways that make your brain scramble to fill the void with sounds that don't exist. You catch yourself holding your breath just to listen for any sign that the world outside still exists, but the white void beyond your walls has absorbed every possible sound. Your own heartbeat has become thunderous in this absolute quiet, each pulse echoing in your ears like drums in an empty cathedral. You can hear your blood moving through your veins, your joints creaking when you move, even the sound of your eyelids closing and opening. Sounds that were always present but masked by the normal ambient noise of life have become magnified into a symphony of biological functions that reminds you constantly that you're still alive in a world that seems to have died around you. The psychological pressure of existing in this soundless void has begun to create auditory hallucinations that feel more real than reality itself. You hear conversations outside your cottage, voices calling your name, footsteps on your roof, knocking on your door. When you investigate, you find nothing but the same oppressive silence, which somehow makes the phantom sounds feel more disturbing than if they had been real. Your brain, desperate for auditory input in a world that provides none, has begun manufacturing its own soundtrack. Here's your sensory deprivation fact that medieval hermits and prisoners discovered through forced experience. Complete silence for extended periods can drive people insane faster than almost any other form of torture. The human brain requires constant sensory input to maintain normal function, and when that input is removed, consciousness begins to generate its own stimulation through hallucinations, delusions, and eventually complete psychological breakdown. You're experiencing involuntary solitary confinement in a cell made of snow. You've started making sounds deliberately just to break the silence, humming, talking to yourself, even banging objects together. But these self-generated noises feel hollow and desperate in the absolute acoustic emptiness. Your voice doesn't echo properly in the muffled environment, making your own speech sound strange and disconnected, like hearing someone else talk through thick walls. The normal auditory feedback that confirms your existence in the world has been eliminated. Sleep has become impossible in the traditional sense because the silence is so complete it feels dangerous, like falling asleep in this soundless void might mean never waking up at all. You doze fitfully, startling awake at the slightest sound, usually sounds you've created yourself, like shifting positions or involuntary bodily noises. The absence of normal background sounds makes every tiny noise feel like an alarm, keeping you in a constant state of low-level panic. Your memory has begun playing tricks with sound, replaying conversations, songs, and ambient noises from your past with such clarity that you sometimes can't tell whether you're remembering or actually hearing them. You find yourself responding to voices from your memory as if they were present conversations, then realizing with crushing disappointment that you're alone in silence once again. Your brain is desperately trying to recreate the auditory landscape of normal life using archive sounds from better times. The concept of time has become even more distorted because you have no auditory data cues to mark its passage. No church bells, no roosters crowing, no sounds of human activity that normally punctuate the day and night cycles. You exist in a temporal void where minutes could be hours and hours could be minutes, with no external reference points to anchor your perception of duration. The silence has stolen not just sound, but time itself. You've discovered that silence can be loud in its own way, a roaring emptiness that fills your consciousness more completely than noise ever could. The absence of sound becomes a presence in itself, something you're constantly aware of, constantly fighting against. You understand now why medieval people believed that complete silence was one of the conditions of hell, not because suffering requires noise, but because the absence of all familiar sounds creates a form of psychological torment that can break minds. Your relationship with your own voice has changed dramatically as it becomes the only sound in your universe. You talk to yourself constantly now, not just for company, but to prove that sound is still possible, that you haven't slipped into some alternate dimension where audio doesn't exist. But even your own voice sounds wrong in this acoustic void, muffled and absorbed by the snow-sealed environment until it loses its familiar qualities. The phantom sounds have become increasingly elaborate and specific. You hear entire conversations happening outside your cottage, complete with different voices, realistic dialogue, and appropriate emotional tones. You hear work sounds, chopping wood, drawing water, people going about normal daily activities that feel so real you sometimes prepare to greet neighbours before remembering that no neighbours could possibly be functioning in the conditions that have buried your entire world. Musical hallucinations have joined the phantom conversations, with your brain generating melodies, rhythms, and even complex polyphonic arrangements that seem to come from outside your head. You hear fiddle music, singing voices, even the sounds of celebration and dancing, all created by a consciousness desperate to fill the silence with something resembling the soundtrack of normal life. These auditory fantasies are so convincing that you sometimes find yourself moving to rhythms that exist only in your damaged neural pathways. The silence has amplified your awareness of internal sounds to an almost unbearable degree. You can hear your stomach gurgling, your breathing changing rhythm, even the sound of saliva moving in your mouth. Your body has become a cacophony of biological processes that were always happening but were masked by environmental noise. You're forced to listen to the soundtrack of your own slow starvation and gradual physical breakdown. Most disturbing of all, you've begun to hear the silence itself as a sound. A low, constant ringing or buzzing that might be tinnitus caused by malnutrition and stress, or might be your brain's attempt to generate audio input when none exists. This phantom noise of nothingness has become the background soundtrack to your buried existence, a constant reminder that your sensory systems are breaking down along with everything else. Your cottage has transformed from a shelter into a complex mechanical system for extracting every possible moment of survival from hostile conditions, but the snow load has begun to alter even these desperate calculations. The walls that once felt solid now flex slightly when wind pressure builds up against the accumulated snow outside, creating a rhythm of expansion and contraction that makes your shelter feel alive in disturbing ways. You're living inside something that breathes with the weather, and you can feel it slowly weakening under stresses it was never designed to handle. The roof beams sag visibly now, bowing under snow weight that continues to accumulate with each hour of continued precipitation. You've placed your cooking pot in strategic locations to catch the increasing number of drips that indicate your shelter is beginning to fail at the most basic level, keeping weather outside and warmth inside. Each new drip represents a small catastrophic failure in your protection system, and you have no materials or methods for repairs that would require access to the exterior of your cottage. Your heating system has evolved into an intricate balance of competing physical principles that would challenge an engineer, except you're operating with the tools and knowledge of a medieval peasant whose education focused on farming rather than thermodynamics. You must burn enough fuel to prevent deadly hypothermia, but not so much that smoke accumulation or carbon dioxide buildup kills you before the cold can. You must maintain enough ventilation to prevent poisoning, but not so much that heat loss defeats the purpose of heating. Every adjustment creates cascading consequences that could prove fatal. Here's your structural engineering fact that medieval builders learned through catastrophic experience. Snow loading creates exponential rather than linear stress increases on wooden frame construction. The first few inches of snow create manageable additional weight, but each subsequent inch adds pressure that multiplies rather than simply accumulates. Your cottage roof was designed to handle the snow loads typical for your region, but whether this extreme is testing tolerances that were never intended to be tested. The interior spaces of your cottage have begun to shrink as the walls gradually bow inward under exterior pressure. Doorways that once opened freely now require force to operate. Windows that once provided views have become sealed completely, not just by snow but by the deformation of their frames. You're experiencing the gradual compression of your living space, watching your world literally get smaller around you as structural elements yield to forces beyond their design limits. Air circulation has become a life or death engineering problem that you solve through intuition and desperation rather than knowledge. You've learnt to read the subtle signs that indicate carbon dioxide buildup, the way your thinking becomes fuzzy, the way small tasks become disproportionately difficult, the way you feel sleepy at inappropriate times. You adjust ventilation by creating tiny gaps in your wall chinking, trading precious heat for life-giving fresh air in calculations that could easily go wrong and kill you. Your water management system has evolved into something resembling the closed-loop life support systems that modern space travelers might recognize, except built from medieval materials and operating on principles you've discovered through trial and error rather than scientific education. You collect, conserve, reuse, and recycle every drop of moisture in your environment, because obtaining new water requires fuel expenditures you might not be able to afford. The structural integrity monitoring, performed daily, would seem obsessive to anyone not living under tons of accumulated snow, but you've learned to read the signs that indicate your shelter is approaching catastrophic failure. New cracks in walls, changes in the way doors fit their frames, variations in the sounds your cottage makes when wind loads shift. You've become a human seismograph detecting the gradual surrender of your protection to forces that don't care about your survival. Your lighting management involves calculations that would challenge an efficiency expert, balancing the need for visibility against fuel conservation, while factoring in the psychological necessity of having some illumination in what has become a cave-like environment. Too little light leads to accidents that could prove fatal in your compromised circumstances. Too much light consumes resources you need for heat. The optimal balance shifts constantly based on outside conditions, your remaining fuel supply, and your psychological state. Temperature gradient management throughout your small space requires understanding and manipulating the physics of heat distribution without the benefit of mechanical systems or scientific instruments. You've learnt to read the microclimates within your cottage, understanding where heat accumulates, where cold air settles, how to direct warm air from your fire to where your body needs it most. You move through your cottage like a thermal engineer, optimizing heat distribution through positioning and timing. The snow accumulation outside has created its own insulation system that both helps and hinders your survival efforts. The white barrier does help retain heat by creating an additional layer of insulation around your cottage, but it also traps gases, reduces ventilation options, and creates structural stresses that threaten to collapse your shelter entirely. You're benefiting from and being threatened by the same environmental factor simultaneously. Smoke management has become perhaps your most critical engineering challenge, requiring you to burn fires that provide adequate heat without producing smoke levels that would asphyxiate you in your increasingly sealed environment. You've learned to judge fuel moisture content, to arrange burning materials for optimal combustion efficiency, to read the signs that indicate dangerous gas accumulation. Your fire has become a complex chemical process that you control through observation and adjustment rather than understanding. Your resource allocation system operates on principles that NASA mission planners would recognize, calculating consumption rates against remaining supplies while factoring in unknown variables that could extend or shorten your mission duration. Except your mission is staying alive until spring in a cottage that's slowly being crushed by weather, and mission failure means death rather than disappointment. The most sophisticated system you've developed is your early warning network for detecting the various ways your situation could deteriorate from merely desperate to immediately fatal. You monitor air quality, structural stability, resource depletion rates, and your own physical condition, with the systematic attention of someone who understands that small problems become big problems very quickly when you have no external support systems and no margin for error. Your calendar has become a collection of scratches carved into the wooden wall beside your bed, each mark representing another day you've managed to survive against increasingly impossible odds. But the scratches have begun to blur together in your memory, creating confusion about whether you've been trapped for weeks or months. Time has become elastic and unreliable when every day is identical, and your brain lacks the glucose needed for reliable memory formation. You count and recount the marks obsessively, trying to calculate how much longer winter could possibly last, but medieval people didn't have access to accurate seasonal predictions, leaving you to guess when salvation might arrive. The mathematics of your situation have evolved into complex equations where multiple variables race against each other toward different forms of catastrophe. Your food will run out before your fuel, but your fuel will run out before your shelter collapses under snow load. But your shelter might collapse before your body gives up entirely from malnutrition. Every calculation leads to death by different means on different timelines, creating a grotesque form of scheduling where you're trying to optimize the order in which various disasters will occur. Spring exists somewhere in your future as a theoretical concept that might arrive in time to save you, or might arrive just in time to reveal your frozen corpse to whoever finds it first. You've started making bargains with the weather, promising sacrifices and behavioral changes in exchange for early warming that you have no power to influence. Medieval people believed in weather magic for the same reason you're developing superstitious behaviors. When you're completely powerless to affect outcomes that determine your survival, ritual feels more productive than acceptance. Here's your temporal survival fact that explains why so many people died in late winter rather than early winter. The human body and mind can sustain emergency conditions for limited periods, but resources depleted over months cannot be restored without external inputs. People who survived the worst of winter weather often died just weeks before spring warmth would have saved them. Not because conditions got worse, but because their accumulated deficits finally exceeded their remaining reserves. Your body has begun operating on borrowed time, consuming resources that cannot be replaced, and performing functions that are gradually shutting down. Each day you survive now comes at the cost of capabilities you'll need for future days, creating a form of temporal cannibalism where your present self is literally eating your future self. You're staying alive by sacrificing the person you'll be tomorrow, assuming you have a tomorrow to sacrifice. The concept of rescue has evolved from hope to fantasy to something approaching delusion, because logical analysis suggests that anyone capable of providing help is facing similar conditions in their own locations. Even if authorities wanted to send relief, transportation through snow depths measured in feet rather than inches would be impossible until natural melting occurs. You're trapped not just by weather, but by the mathematical reality that everyone else is probably trapped too. Sleep patterns have become completely divorced from natural day-night cycles because your buried cottage exists in perpetual twilight that provides no external cues about time passage. You sleep when exhaustion overwhelms you, and wake when cold or hunger demands attention, creating a personal temporal system based on biological necessity rather than solar rhythm. Your internal clock has been reset by survival imperatives that care nothing about conventional time measurement. Your fuel consumption calculations have become exercises in optimistic fiction, where you repeatedly adjust variables to create scenarios where your remaining resources might last until spring, despite evidence that no realistic consumption rate could stretch your supplies that far. You calculate slower burning rates, lower temperature thresholds, alternative fuel sources that probably don't exist, anything to make the mathematics work out in your favour. These aren't realistic plans, they are mathematical fairy tales told by someone who can't accept the honest numbers. The psychological timeline has become more important than the actual calendar, because your mental state deteriorates on its own schedule regardless of external conditions. Each day of isolation, malnutrition and stress damages your cognitive abilities in ways that accumulate and compound. You might physically survive until spring but mentally collapse weeks before rescue becomes possible, creating scenarios where salvation arrives too late to save the person you used to be. Food fantasies have evolved from simple hunger dreams into complex temporal negotiations, where you promise your future self that you'll make up for current deprivation through excessive eating once resources become available again. But your future self might not have a functioning digestive system capable of processing normal food after months of malnutrition, making these psychological contracts with prosperity fundamentally dishonest, even if the prosperity materializes. Your cottage maintenance schedule has become a form of wishful thinking disguised as practical planning, where you ration repair materials and postpone structural interventions based on optimistic assumptions about how long your shelter needs to remain functional. You're managing deterioration rather than preventing it, trying to slow the collapse of your protection long enough for external conditions to change before internal systems fail completely. The most complex calculation involves determining the optimal point to give up various survival strategies in favour of others, recognizing that your energy and resources are insufficient to maintain all your systems indefinitely. Should you stop heating your cottage to save fuel for cooking? Should you stop moving around to conserve calories for essential functions? These decisions feel like choosing which parts of yourself to sacrifice first in hopes that what remains will be adequate for survival. Weather pattern analysis has become a form of fortune-telling where you search for signs that winter might end early this year, despite having no historical knowledge of climate patterns or meteorological indicators that would make such predictions meaningful. You interpret every small change in wind direction, every variation in snowfall intensity, as potential evidence that the season is shifting toward warmth, because hope disguised as analysis feels more rational than hope acknowledged as desperation. The countdown toward various forms of failure has created a psychological state where you're simultaneously planning for survival and preparing for death, trying to optimize whatever time remains while acknowledging that time itself might be the scarcest resource of all. You're living in the space between hope and acceptance, counting days that might lead to rescue or might simply measure the duration of your final struggle against inevitability. The first drop of meltwater from your cottage roof hits the floor with a sound like salvation announcing itself, and for a moment your heart nearly stops with the possibility that winter might be ending at last. But this single drop is followed by nothing but the familiar silence, making you wonder if you imagined it or if your desperate mind is creating auditory hallucinations of the sounds you most want to hear. You stare at the small puddle on your floor like it contains messages from the outside world, searching for signs that the tyranny of cold and snow might finally be loosening its grip on your frozen universe. Over the following hours, the dripping becomes more frequent but not necessarily more promising. Because meltwater in late winter doesn't always mean spring has arrived, it can mean that the massive snow load on your roof is creating pressure that melts the bottom layers while the top remains frozen solid. This creates the worst possible scenario. Structural stress from snow weight combined with water damage as melted snow finds every weakness in your cottage's defences against moisture. Your shelter is being attacked by both ice and water simultaneously. The sound of running water somewhere within your walls has begun to create a psychological torture more refined than simple cold or hunger, because it represents the tantalizing possibility of improvement combined with the terrifying certainty of new problems. Water running where it shouldn't be means your cottage is failing in ways that could collapse your shelter. Just as conditions are potentially beginning to improve, you're experiencing hope and despair in alternating waves, sometimes from minute to minute, Here's your seasonal survival fact that explains why late winter was traditionally the most dangerous time for medieval people. Melting and refreezing cycles create structural stresses that can destroy buildings that successfully weathered months of stable cold conditions. Many people who survived the worst of winter died when changing temperatures created ice dams, roof collapses, and flooding that eliminated shelter just as survival seemed most possible. Your relationship with the melting process has become obsessively analytical as you try to distinguish between different types of water sounds and what they might indicate about your prospects. Steady dripping could mean consistent warming. Intermittent dripping could mean temporary temperature fluctuations. The sound of water running inside your walls could mean catastrophic structural failure. You've become a forensic investigator of acoustic evidence, trying to diagnose the condition of your world through sounds that might mean salvation or destruction. The first sign of actual daylight penetrating your snow-sealed cottage arrives as a dim glow that filters through layers of white outside your window, so faint you're not sure whether you're seeing light or imagining it after weeks of living in artificial twilight. But this possible illumination creates excitement so intense it's almost painful, because natural light means the snow barrier is thinning enough to let photons through, which means the cubic yards of frozen water that have trapped you might eventually release their grip. Temperature fluctuations inside your cottage begin to create new, survival challenges as conditions shift from stable extreme cold toward unpredictable variation between freezing and not quite freezing. Your carefully calibrated heating system, developed over weeks of consistent conditions, no longer works effectively when outside temperatures swing wildly throughout each day. You're forced to constantly adjust your fuel consumption and fire management to accommodate changing conditions you can't predict or control. The snow against your windows has started showing signs of settling and compaction that could indicate melting at the base. But this creates the terrifying possibility that massive amounts of snow could shift position suddenly, potentially crushing your cottage under avalanche conditions that would be impossible to survive. Your buried shelter exists in a precarious balance where melting could either free you or kill you, depending on how the physics of snow displacement work out around your specific location. Ice formation inside your cottage has become a new problem as meltwater seeps through your walls and freezes again in the cold interior air, creating ice buildup in places where ice has never existed before. Your floor becomes slippery and dangerous. Your walls develop ice coatings that steal precious heat. You're dealing with winter conditions inside your shelter, even as conditions outside might be beginning to improve, creating a situation where spring and winter battle for control of your living space. Water management has evolved from conservation to damage control as melting snow creates more liquid water than you can collect, use or store, while simultaneously threatening to flood or destroy your cottage through structural damage. You need this water for survival, but too much water too quickly could eliminate the shelter that keeps you alive. You're trying to capture life-giving moisture while preventing life-threatening floods, managing abundance and scarcity simultaneously. The psychological impact of possible rescue has created a new form of torture where hope becomes as painful as despair, because hope requires energy you might not have and creates expectations that could be devastating if disappointed. Part of you wants to remain emotionally numb rather than risk the crushing disappointment of believing conditions are improving, only to discover that winter has additional cruelties in reserve for people optimistic enough to think they might survive. Air circulation improvements as snow barriers begin to shift have brought fresh oxygen into your cottage for the first time in weeks, but also cold air that undermines your carefully maintained heating systems. Better air quality improves your thinking and reduces carbon dioxide poisoning, but increased ventilation makes maintaining adequate temperature more difficult with your depleted fuel supplies. Every improvement in one survival parameter creates deterioration in others. The most cruel aspect of potential melting is that it creates the possibility of survival just as your body and mind are approaching complete breakdown, forcing you to maintain hope and struggle when it would be psychologically easier to give up. Spring might arrive in time to save your life, but too late to save your health, your sanity, or your capacity to enjoy the survival you fought so hard to achieve. Timing has become everything and nothing simultaneously. Everything because small differences in when melting occurs could determine whether you live or die, and nothing because you have absolutely no control over weather patterns that operate on scales far beyond human influence. You're entirely dependent on forces that don't know you exist, hoping for salvation from systems that care nothing about your individual survival, waiting for rescue from a universe that has already demonstrated its complete indifference to your continued existence. Your final inventory reveals numbers that would be comical if they weren't tragic. Enough food for perhaps 3 days if you eat portions small enough to mock the concept of nourishment. Enough fuel for maybe a week if you're willing to let your cottage temperature drop to levels that would probably kill you anyway. The mathematics have reached their inevitable conclusion, where survival requires resources you no longer possess, creating a situation where death has become a scheduling problem rather than an abstract possibility. You're not dying slowly anymore. You're dying on a specific timeline that you can calculate with disturbing precision. The choice facing you is no longer between different survival strategies, but between different ways of dying, and the options are limited and uniformly unappealing. You can starve to death while staying warm, freeze to death while preserving food you're too dead to eat, or attempt some desperate action that probably guarantees immediate death, but offers a microscopic chance of dramatically changing your circumstances. Medieval people called these death choices, and they understood that sometimes the manner of dying was the only thing left under your control. Your neighbour's cottage, visible now through slightly melted snowdrifts, represents both your greatest hope and your most damning moral challenge. If they're dead, their resources could extend your survival by days or weeks. If they're alive, taking their resources means condemning them to die so that you might live. If they're in similar condition to you, combining resources might give both of you a slightly better chance than either would have alone. But investigating means expending energy you can't afford to waste if the expedition proves fruitless. Here's your moral mathematics fact that medieval chroniclers recorded but rarely discussed in detail. When survival required choosing who lives and who dies, people made those choices based on practical calculations rather than ethical principles. Age, health, likelihood of survival, potential future, contribution to community welfare, all became factors in decisions about resource allocation when resources were insufficient to keep everyone alive. These weren't evil choices, they were impossible choices made by people trapped in impossible circumstances. The expedition to your neighbour's cottage would require opening your door for the first time in weeks, losing precious accumulated heat while exposing yourself to outdoor conditions that could kill you within minutes if your weakened body can't handle the temperature shock. But staying in your cottage guarantees death by resource depletion, while investigating next door offers at least the theoretical possibility of finding supplies, assistance or different options for facing the final stages of winter survival. Your physical condition makes any significant exertion extremely dangerous, because your body lacks the energy or reserves needed to recover from activities that would have been routine when you were well fed and healthy. Walking through snowdrifts, breaking into a cottage, searching for supplies, returning home, any of these tasks could demand more calories than your starving muscles can provide, leading to collapse in conditions where rescue would be impossible. The tools available for breaking into your neighbour's cottage are pathetic remnants of implements that were never designed for burglary. A rusty knife, some wooden tools worn down by months of desperate use, your bare hands that have lost most of their strength and dexterity. Medieval locks were simple but effective, and doors were built to keep people out, especially when those people are weakened by starvation and operating in life-threatening weather conditions. Time calculations have become cruelly precise as you weigh the energy cost of action against the energy cost of inaction, trying to determine whether the calories burned by investigating your neighbour's cottage are justified by the probability of finding resources that would replace more calories than the investigation consumes. This isn't moral reasoning anymore. It's pure mathematics applied to biological functions, calculating survival probabilities like an accountant reviewing budget projections. The psychological preparation for potentially finding your neighbour's body, or finding them alive and having to decide whether to help them or compete with them for resources, represents a form of mental rehearsal that would have been unthinkable months ago. You're planning for scenarios that would have horrified your former self, but your former self never faced choices between different people's deaths when resources were sufficient to save only some of the people who needed saving. Weather conditions during your planned expedition could range from merely life-threatening to immediately fatal, depending on wind, temperature, and snow conditions that you have no way to predict or prepare for adequately. Medieval people had no weather forecasting systems, beyond folk wisdom and observation of natural signs that were often unreliable. You're gambling your life on weather conditions that could change suddenly and catastrophically while you're exposed and vulnerable. The moral weight of your decision feels simultaneously enormous and irrelevant, because ethics designed for normal circumstances provide no guidance for situations where all available choices lead to someone's death. Whether you act or don't act, people will die, possibly including yourself. The question isn't whether to cause deaths, but whose deaths to cause, and how many deaths might be prevented by actions that guarantee other deaths. Your backup plan, if the expedition fails or proves impossible, involves consuming the last of your resources as efficiently as possible, while waiting for death with whatever dignity you can maintain under circumstances that have already stripped away most forms of human dignity. Medieval people understood that death could be met with grace or desperation, and they considered the manner of dying to be important even when the fact of dying was inevitable. The final irony is that spring might arrive within days of when you die, meaning that salvation could be so close as to make your death seem like a cruel joke played by timing and weather patterns that care nothing about individual human struggles. But you'll never know whether rescue was hours away or months away, because death creates its own form of certainty that eliminates all speculation about alternative outcomes. Your last gamble with death isn't really a gamble at all. It's an acknowledgement that you've reached the point where dying while trying is preferable to dying while waiting, where action and inaction both lead to the same destination, but different routes might preserve different aspects of what remains of your humanity. You're not choosing whether to die, you're choosing how to spend whatever time remains before death completes its patient work. You wake up to actual sunlight filtering through your window for the first time in months, and the emotion that overwhelms you isn't joy or relief, but a profound exhaustion that goes deeper than physical fatigue. The light reveals the true devastation of your cottage: broken furniture used for fuel, walls stained with smoke and moisture, floors covered with the debris of desperate survival. More disturbing is what the light reveals about you: clothes hanging loose on a frame that barely resembles your former body, hands that shake constantly, eyes that have trouble focusing on objects more than arm's length away. Your reflection in the small piece of polished metal you use as a mirror shows someone you don't recognize wearing your clothes. Your face has become angular and hollow, with skin that hangs loose over bone structure made prominent by the consumption of muscle and fat. Your hair has thinned and lost its colour, aged years in months. Your teeth feel loose in gums that bleed when you eat. You look like someone who's been dead for weeks but hasn't yet received the news, a walking skeleton animated by willpower and stubbornness rather than health. The psychological changes are less visible but more profound than the physical transformation. You realise you haven't felt genuine emotion in weeks. Not happiness, sadness, fear or anger, just a flat numbness that makes everything feel like something happening to someone else. Medieval physicians would have diagnosed this as soul sickness, understanding that extreme conditions could damage the spirit in ways that wear harder to heal than broken bones or wounded flesh. Here's your recovery fact that medieval survivors learned through bitter experience. The end of crisis doesn't mean the end of damage, and some changes made by extreme survival conditions are permanent rather than temporary. People who lived through famines often suffered lifelong digestive problems, joint damage and cognitive impairments that persisted long after adequate food became available again. Survival has a price that continues to be paid for years after the original debt was incurred. Your relationship with food has been fundamentally altered in ways that might never return to normal. The thought of eating a full meal creates anxiety rather than anticipation, because your stomach has shrunk and your digestive system has forgotten how to process normal quantities of nutrition. You approach eating with the cautious planning of someone handling dangerous materials, carefully calculating portions and monitoring your body's response to prevent the refeeding syndrome that can kill people who eat too much too quickly after prolonged starvation. Sleep has become elusive despite your exhaustion, because your nervous system has been trained by months of crisis to interpret rest as dangerous vulnerability. You wake up every hour or two in panic, checking your fire, your food stores, your water supply, unable to accept that external conditions have improved enough to allow unguarded sleep. Your brain continues to operate in survival mode even though survival is no longer an immediate question. The social aspects of recovery feel more challenging than the physical aspects, because you've spent months becoming someone who could make choices that your former moral framework would have condemned. You remember planning to steal from neighbours, calculating the caloric value of other people's lives, making decisions based purely on individual survival rather than community welfare. These memories create a form of shame that goes deeper than embarrassment, You're ashamed of who you had to become to stay alive. Your cottage feels simultaneously too small and too large now that you don't need to conserve every degree of warmth and every resource with desperate precision. The habits developed during crisis continue automatically. You hoard food you don't need, burn fires smaller than necessary, ration water that's now abundant. Your survival behaviours have become compulsions that persist despite changed circumstances, like a soldier who continues to duck at every loud noise long after the war has ended. Trust has become a concept you understand intellectually but can't feel emotionally, because trusting anything or anyone to remain stable and supportive feels impossibly naive after months of discovering that everything you depended on could disappear without warning. Your neighbours, your shelter, your food supply, even your own body, everything proved unreliable when conditions became severe enough. The idea of depending on external stability feels like volunteering for betrayal. The economic relationships that once governed your life feel abstract and meaningless after months of operating in a survival economy where the only currency was the immediate utility towards staying alive. Money, debt, property rights, social obligations, these concepts exist in a world where people have margins for error and resources for non-essential activities. You're struggling to remember why any of these things mattered when your entire existence was focused on acquiring calories and maintaining body temperature. Memory itself has been damaged by months of malnutrition and stress, creating gaps and distortions that make you uncertain about events from before the crisis began. You remember survival-related information with perfect clarity, but struggle to recall details about normal life, relationships, activities that weren't directly connected to staying alive. Your brain has been reorganized around crisis management, and non-essential information has been deleted to make space for survival data. The capacity for pleasure has been diminished in ways that make recovery feel hollow even as conditions improve. Food tastes flat and uninteresting. Warmth feels neutral rather than comfortable. Safety feels boring rather than relieving. Your nervous system has been recalibrated to respond to extreme conditions, and normal pleasant experiences no longer register as significant enough to generate positive emotions. Language itself has been affected by months of having no one to talk to except yourself, and your internal dialogue became focused entirely on immediate practical concerns rather than abstract thoughts or creative expression. You find yourself struggling to form complex sentences, forgetting words for concepts that aren't related to survival, speaking in the choppy practical phrases of someone who has learned to conserve even mental energy. The most disturbing change is the realization that part of you misses the clarity and simplicity of crisis conditions, where every decision had obvious importance and every day had clear, achievable goals. Normal life requires choices about matters that don't directly affect survival, and these decisions feel simultaneously trivial and overwhelming to someone whose decision-making apparatus has been optimized for life or death situations. You survived, but survival required becoming someone who could tolerate conditions and make choices that have permanently altered your fundamental relationship with existence, other people, and yourself. The person who enters spring is related to but not identical with the person who entered winter, and some of the changes made by survival are irreversible modifications to the basic architecture of consciousness itself. Spring arrives with birdsongs that sound like foreign languages after months of silence, but instead of joy, these sounds trigger anxiety attacks that leave you shaking and confused. Your nervous system, rewired by months of interpreting any unexpected sound as potential danger, can't distinguish between threats and normal environmental noise. The cheerful chirping that once signaled renewal and hope now feels like an assault on senses that have been trained to expect only bad news from the auditory world. Your hands have developed a permanent tremor that affects your ability to perform simple tasks like eating or drinking without spilling. Medieval physicians called this winter shake, understanding that prolonged stress and malnutrition could damage the nervous system in ways that persisted long after the original causes were removed. You find yourself dropping things constantly, struggling with tasks that once required no conscious thought, frustrated by the betrayal of motor skills that used to be automatic and reliable. The phantom pains have been in it, sharp sabbing sensations in parts of your body that appear uninjured, but were damaged by months of malnutrition and extreme cold. Your feet ache constantly despite being warm and dry. Your joints send pain signals even when you're not moving. Your stomach cramps regularly, even when you haven't eaten anything that could cause digestive distress. Your body has developed a chronic pain condition that exists independently of current circumstances, Here's your long-term damage fact that medieval medical texts documented but couldn't treat. Prolonged starvation creates permanent changes in bone density, joint function, and nervous system operation that can cause lifelong disability, even in people who make full recoveries in other ways. The medieval term famine bones referred to skeletal damage that made people vulnerable to fractures and joint problems for the rest of their lives, regardless of how well they ate afterward. Your sleep is haunted by dreams that aren't quite nightmares but aren't peaceful either. Endless repetitions of survival activities where you search for food that doesn't exist, tend fires that won't stay lit, try to escape from cottages that keep changing size and shape. You wake up more exhausted than when you went to sleep, as if you've been working all night instead of resting. Your brain continues to practice survival scenarios even though survival is no longer in question. Food relationships have become permanently complicated by associations between specific items and memories of desperate hunger. Bread, which once represented comfort and sustenance, now triggers memories of gnawing leather and eating tallow. The sight and smell of normal meals can cause nausea and anxiety rather than appetite. Your digestive system has developed an adversarial relationship with nutrition, simultaneously craving and rejecting the food your body needs to heal. Social interactions feel impossible because your conversation skills have atrophied during months of having no one to talk to, and your topics of interest have been reduced to survival concerns that other people find disturbing or incomprehensible. You want to tell people about the ingenious ways you conserved fuel or managed water supplies, but these accomplishments sound like the ravings of someone obsessed with topics that normal people consider boring or morbid. Your tolerance for normal human problems has been eliminated by months of facing issues that were literally the matters of life and death. When neighbours complain about minor inconveniences, you feel a rage that seems disproportionate to their offence, but makes perfect sense to someone who has learned to distinguish between real problems and trivial annoyances. Your perspective has been permanently calibrated to crisis conditions, making normal concerns seem pathetically insignificant. The hypervigilance developed during winter continues to operate at full intensity, even though threats no longer exist at every moment. You find yourself constantly scanning for dangers, monitoring resource levels, calculating backup plans for problems that aren't going to occur. Your threat assessment system can't be turned off, leaving you exhausted by the constant work of monitoring in an environment that's actually safe. Memory problems have created gaps in your personal history that make you feel disconnected from your own past. You can remember survival details with perfect clarity, but struggle to recall relationships, celebrations, ordinary days from before the crisis began. It's as if your entire life before winter has been overwritten by survival data, leaving you with the psychological equivalent of amnesia for everything that wasn't directly related to staying alive. Your emotional range has been compressed to a narrow band between anxiety and numbness, with little capacity for experiencing the positive emotions that make life worth living. Joy feels foreign and suspicious. Laughter seems inappropriate. Hope feels dangerous because hoping for things led to disappointment during the worst months. Your emotional vocabulary has been reduced to variations on fear, anger, and desperate determination. Physical contact with other people has become disturbing rather than comforting, because your body has learned to interpret all unexpected sensations as potential threats. Hugs feel like restraints. Casual touches feel like attacks. Your nervous system can't distinguish between affection and aggression, responding to all physical contact with the defensive reflexes developed during months of vulnerability. The most profound changes in your relationship with time itself. Normal planning for weeks or months in the future feels absurdly optimistic to someone who learned to think in terms of days or hours. Long-term goals seem meaningless when you have experienced how quickly everything can change. Your temporal perspective has been compressed to immediate concerns, making it difficult to invest energy in activities that don't provide immediate survival benefits. You realize that surviving winter required you to become someone who could tolerate unacceptable conditions and make unthinkable choices, but that person doesn't automatically disappear when conditions improve. The psychological modifications made by extreme circumstances have become permanent features of your mental landscape, creating a version of yourself that's adapted for crisis, but poorly suited for normal life. You survived winter, but winter also survived in you, creating internal conditions that might never return to what they were before you learned exactly how much you could lose and still continue breathing. Summer arrives with abundance that feels almost violent after months of scarcity. Fruits ripening on trees, vegetables growing in gardens, streams running clear and cold, sunshine that provides warmth without cost. But instead of relief or gratitude, this plenty triggers a form of survivor's guilt that makes enjoyment feel like betrayal of everyone who didn't make it through winter. You eat fresh bread and remember the taste of leather. You drink clean water and recall the metallic tang of melted snow mixed with roof runoff. Every pleasure is poisoned by memory. Your body rebels against abundance with a phenomenon medieval physicians called refeeding sickness. The digestive system, adapted to extreme scarcity, can't process normal amounts of food without causing severe pain, nausea, and dangerous metabolic imbalances. You must eat tiny portions despite ravenous hunger, watching your body reject the nutrition it desperately needs. Recovery becomes another form of suffering where healing hurts as much as the original damage. The hoarding instinct developed during winter refuses to acknowledge that resources are now plentiful. You find yourself hiding food even from yourself, creating secret caches throughout your living space, unable to shake the conviction that scarcity will return without warning. Your rational mind knows this behavior is unnecessary, but your survival brain operates on different logic, one written in the language of desperation and sealed with the memory of near death. Social gatherings and summer celebrations feel like performances in a language you no longer speak. People laugh about trivial things while you calculate how many days their food stores would last if winter returned tomorrow. They complain about the heat while you remember praying for even a moment of warmth. Their casual waste of resources, throwing away bread crusts, leaving candles burning unnecessarily, triggers rage so intense you have to leave before you say things that would mark you as irreparably damaged. Your skin bears permanent marks from frostbite that summer. Sun can't heal. Patches of numbness, areas of hypersensitivity, scars that ache in ways that have nothing to do with current weather. Your body has become a map of winter's territory, each mark a reminder that survival came with costs that compound interest daily. The warm weather everyone else celebrates feels like a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent condition. Here's your summer horror that no one warns you about. The anxiety of abundance can be worse than the clarity of crisis, because at least during winter you knew exactly what the problem was and what you needed to do to address it. Now, surrounded by plenty, you're paralyzed by choices and possibilities, unable to enjoy what you have because you're constantly preparing for its loss. The weight you gain back doesn't distribute normally. Your body, trained by starvation, stores every calorie as if preparing for another siege, creating deposits of fat in strange places while leaving muscles weak and wasted. You look simultaneously overfed and malnourished, your body's appearance telling the story of feast and famine in ways that make people uncomfortable to look at you. Children playing in summer sunshine trigger the most complex emotions: envy for their ignorance of what winter can really mean, terror that they'll have to learn the same lessons you did, anger that they waste energy on games when they should be preparing for the next crisis. You've lost the ability to see summer as anything but the preparation period for the next winter. Your dreams have evolved from survival scenarios to something worse, dreams where winter never happened, where you're still the person you were before learning what desperation really means. You wake from these dreams of normalcy into the nightmare of being someone who can never return to that state of innocence. The person who didn't know what they were capable of doing to survive is gone forever. The summer garden that should represent hope instead becomes a source of obsessive anxiety. You tend vegetables with the intensity of someone whose life depends on every single plant because your body remembers when it did. You can't enjoy the process of growth because you're constantly calculating yields, preservation methods, storage strategies. Beauty has been replaced by utility in every aspect of your perception. Medieval texts describe a condition called summer madness in famine survivors, a state where the contrast between abundance and recent scarcity creates a form of cognitive dissonance that manifests as irrational behavior, emotional volatility, and inability to adapt to improved circumstances. You recognize yourself in these ancient descriptions, understanding that your inability to enjoy summer is itself a symptom of winter's lasting damage. Physical intimacy remains impossible because your body has learned to interpret all vulnerability as danger. The relaxation required for pleasure feels like dropping defenses you might need at any moment. Your nervous system maintains combat readiness even in the safest circumstances, making peace feel more threatening than conflict because at least conflict is familiar. The gratitude everyone expects you to feel for surviving becomes its own burden. People want inspiring stories of resilience and recovery, but your story is one of permanent damage and ongoing struggle. They want you to be grateful for summer's abundance, but gratitude requires an emotional capacity that was burned as fuel during the coldest months. You survived, but survival and living are different things entirely. The cruelest truth of your second summer is this. You've discovered that the opposite of dying isn't living, it's continuing. You continue to eat, sleep, work, and exist in a world that looks the same but feels entirely different through eyes that have seen too much. Summer tastes like ash, not because the food is wrong, but because your ability to taste joy was permanently altered by months of tasting only desperation. You survived winter in body, but in spirit, you remain frozen in that moment when you realize that everything you thought you knew about yourself was just the luxury of never having been truly tested.